Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be continuing on my series of retrospectives on games developed by Telltale Games. We're here for another 10-year anniversary. I'll be talking about my thoughts on Tales from the Borderlands, a game that I've claimed in the past is one of the best games developed by Telltale. A game that, while it continues the typical Telltale formula gameplay-wise, a few modifications, and also the standard 5-episode structure that Telltale is known for, all of which will become very stale very soon in this point in Telltale's history, I do think it is a game that actually does very well, setting itself apart from the other Telltale games. Being a fun story, fitting within the Borderlands franchise, being a shakeup for Telltale, this being the first game using the Telltale formula to be based on a gaming IP, an idea that seems pretty insane on paper, with the Borderlands IP being radically different from the likes of The Walking Dead or The Wolf Among Us. I mean, taking a first-person loot shooter and transforming it into a narrative-focused adventure game. Despite how ridiculous that seems to be, it really does work here. Again, taking Telltale away from these stories that they have told in the past that have these dark, grimy tones, while this game feels much more in line with a high-action sci-fi blockbuster, probably being the largest scaled story from a Telltale game up to this point, all while it still sticks to the Borderlands identity and having this stylish presentation, this over-the-top comedic tone, while tackling these anti-capitalist themes where, from what I understand, this is a game that is even well revered within the Borderlands community, looked as one of the best stories told within that series. And through that, I should mention the fact that you don't need to be a fan of the OG IP to enjoy this story, where, again, straight up, I'm personally not a fan of the main series. I've never finished any entry in the main series, where despite that, I really do love this game, to where obviously there are references that might go over your head and reoccurring characters that you won't recognize, but none of that ends up being a major hindrance to this game, with the narrative in its own right being very compelling and providing some very likable and relatable original characters that end up being the true draw to this game's story. Now, like my other Telltale retrospectives, I will be spending the bulk of this video running through the story from beginning to end, talking about other miscellaneous topics along the way, and with that, let's get started. Episode 1, Zer0 Sum. A very satisfactory intro to the season here, introducing obviously this game's characters, their backgrounds, and doing a lot of world building, with this being a pretty expansive episode, being one of the longest Telltale episodes, where obviously most Telltale episodes take around 2-ish hours to complete, while this one runs closer to 3 hours. This episode in its own right feeling like it could be its own feature film, with this probably being one of my favorite premieres amongst the Telltale catalog. Though the game does start with opening narration by Marcus Kincaid, a character from the OG game who ends up narrating all the recap sequences of every episode, and here ends up explaining the premise of Borderlands for newcomers, again being a nice introduction for those that haven't played the original games, with this game actually being canon to the main series, taking place after Borderlands 2, directly continuing off the events of that game, particularly in its connection to Handsome Jack, that game's antagonist, who ends up being a major character in this game down the road. But again, cool to see this game actually matter to the Borderlands franchise, instead of just being this side piece to where it does show Gearbox actually putting faith into Telltale here to make a story that feels in line with the main game, creating characters that they would want to utilize down the road, which again, that leads to mixed results, with them kind of butchering those characters down the road, but again, it at least shows some faith from Gearbox themselves in this product here. But the game does open in medias res, introducing us to our first main character in Reese, who's in the middle of a desert looking for who ends up being the other main character in Fiona, saying that they can work this out, instantly adding this mystery of what went wrong between these two, though eventually we do see a stranger approach him and proceed to knock him out, with the stranger ending up asking him about the Gortys project, with this clearly being a targeted kidnapping here, with the stranger wanting something out of Reese, also setting up the mystery of how exactly this kidnapper ends up being involved in the story. But obviously all this ends up being the frame narrative for the bulk of the story taking place the previous year, with what we see being the retellings of the story to this kidnapper, which ends up being an interesting aspect of the story here, with both Reese and Fiona being unreliable narrators, which can be used for humor at points, adding to the surrealism of the story to where it makes you question if these events actually happen in the way that they're described. But with that, we do cut to the starting point of the story, going from a desert to Helios, a space station above Pandora, the main planet this game revolves around, to where here we do end up learning about Reese's backstory, him being an employee of Hyperion Ryan, who idolizes Handsome Jack, the company's former CEO, posing in front of his poster and really just coming off as a typical company man awaiting a promotion, with him instantly coming off unlikable here in his talk about having to stab people in the back to get where he is, and him again coming off egotistical, which, to be fair, this is done in such an over-the-top way to where I don't feel like you ever really take Reese seriously during this portion of the story, with, again, this persona really coming off as a facade, with him in reality being a much more meek and incompetent figure, which allows for development down the road, but also makes him feel like a somewhat grounded character here, showing him as a largely imperfect person that makes him feel more real despite him being in this crazy, wacky world, which ends up leading to him being a pretty likable character despite him clearly having these character flaws. And I do think a lot of this does come from his portrayal, where Reese is portrayed here by Troy Baker, where outside of the obvious, I mean, this probably ends up being my next favorite performance from him, obviously being a much more comedic performance, but one that's able to really highlight the development that Reese goes through. And really just in general, this game does have some really strong voice acting. It doesn't just stop with Reese here, where it ends up being a really landmark cast filled with the who's who of video game voice acting, and even some celebrities along the way, at least is having a pretty prestigious cast. And with that, we do then get introduced to Reese's best friend in Vaughn, one of the major side characters in this game, voiced by Chris Hardwick, which is really random, but yes, he comes off as a loyal friend despite you having the opportunity and dialogue to undermine his importance to Reese's success. But again, he ends up coming off as a largely likable character here, though he's the one that has a lot less depth than Reese, though again is effectively used for comedic relief throughout the story. And I should mention the fact that with every character introduction we get here, we do get this very over-the-top title card, which is a tradition within the Borderlands series, having the character's name and a witty remark about them underneath it, again, keeping alive the series' identity. But eventually we see Reese entering his boss, Henderson's office, with him expecting to be promoted, only for the reveal that Reese's rival in Vasquez has been promoted instead, with Vasquez being this very tropey, one-note rival figure for Reese, though another one that's perfectly portrayed here by Patrick Warburton, aka Joe Swanson from Family Guy, or David Puddy from Seinfeld, which again is another really random celebrity to be thrown into this cast here. But through that, Vasquez ends up being a pretty fun character here, largely him being the personification of Hyperion for the first few episodes, with us getting the reveal of Henderson's dead body floating outside in space, implying that that's how Vasquez got his promotion here. But at this point, we do see Vasquez getting a call from a man named August, clearly voiced by Nolan North, trying to do a different accent, but this does give us our first bit of gameplay that isn't a dialogue choice here, as while Vasquez is on the call, we do end up using Reese's Echo Eye to scan Vasquez's computer to hack into it, where we learn of Vasquez's deal to buy a vault key from August, though the Echo Eye ends up being a mechanic commonly used during the puzzle sections in this game, being this like Eagle Vision style mechanic that allows you to see interactable objects and scan them. Again, helping with the puzzle solving, though really the puzzle solving in this game's really easy, but can also lead to some humorous descriptions of things, where again, they typically fit in line with what you would expect from the Borderlands series. But this scene does culminate with Vasquez telling Reese of his new promotion, that to assistant vice janitor, with this obviously leading to Reese and Vaughn creating a plan alongside their other friend in Yvette, who is a mostly pointless character, literally feeling like she was written in here just to provide some gear at points and also later betray them down the road. But their plan has them obviously taking the vault key for themselves to use it as leverage to get Reese the promotion he desires, with Vaughn being in accounting here, allowing him to provide the money that they need to buy the vault key, while Yvette ends up giving them clearance to go to Pandora, I guess. So she's somewhat useful. We see them enact the plan, first up by stealing Vasquez's car and driving it to the surface in Pandora, aka doing something illegal anyway, which kind of nullifies the point of them even getting clearance to go to Pandora. But this ends up giving us our opening credits, which for every episode ends up being a really cool sequence, usually being extremely stylish in their presentation, with also this game having a great soundtrack with different opening songs for every episode that very much feel in line with the episode's tone. The sequence ends up funnily ending with Reese accidentally running over a skag, with us seeing them freaking out over now being murderers, showing them being well out of their comfort zone, which obviously this classism displayed by the differences of those that live on Helios and the people that live on Pandora is obviously a theme that's constantly reiterated in this game. Here we see them arrive at Prosperity Junction, conveniently the same place we were at at the beginning of the game in the present, which is a bandit town with us seeing people being beaten along the streets, clearly implying impending danger. But we also get our first explorable area, kind of. Again, a really small one where we do stop down to ask for directions to the meeting place, which ends up being the World of Curiosities, where we end up asking a guy cooking some skags, who we can proceed to call Greaseface. But obviously this interaction ends up turning hostile after, I'll call him by his real name now, Rudiger sees that they are from Hyperion and attempts to steal the money that they have, giving us our first action sequence in the game, where we have Reese calling in Loaderbot, a robot that they're able to utilize for combat here, though it later ends up transitioning into a full-blown character. Another largely likable one, particularly due to its undying loyalty for Reese, and ends up obviously being a largely integral character to the plot down the road. But as we call it in, we are given choices here on what weapons it can use, which ends up being a pretty pointless set of choices, where in general, I do feel like that is a pretty lacking aspect of this game, and that there really is a lack of significant choices to where, again, that's obviously always been a criticism of Telltale games in general, to where no matter what choices you make, it almost always eventually course corrects. Yeah, I do feel like this is a game where the choices particularly don't matter. Feeling like a bit of a new low for Telltale in that sense, with there being very few times that your choices actually have much of an impact outside of the respective scene that they are made in. And to be fair, again, the characters and the story of this game are so good to where it makes you not really care about any of that. But I do think for a Telltale game that is meant to at least keep the appearance of your choices mattering, I do feel like this is a game that doesn't really even bother to do that most of the time, outside of things like cosmetic differences or points where animations play out differently because of the weapons you choose, where again, it does feel like there's a lack of narrative significance from your choices, which can be looked at as lackluster. And sadly, this ends up essentially being the norm for a lot of Telltale games beyond this. Though again, this ends up being a pretty expansive action sequence, which ends up being a pretty big step up for Telltale here, and these action sequences being on a much grander scale than anything we had seen beforehand in The Walking Dead or Wolf Among Us, adding to this game's more cinematic nature. But through it, we do end up having Reese coming off as pretty pathetic here, again running away in panic from gunfire, only to be cornered by a bandit, and proceed to hurt his hand when attempting to punch him, only to be saved by a stun baton that Yvette ended up conveniently giving him before they left, with him using it to knock Rudiger out of the way, and in doing so, conveniently unveiling the World of Curiosity sign. How convenient. But the section does end with Loaderbot getting Reese and Vaughn into the building, only for him to be jumped by bandits, to where, as it starts to get destroyed, we are given our first major choice in this game of telling Loaderbot to either self-destruct or evacuate, a choice that, again, doesn't really matter, as either way, Loaderbot will still come back to you and his overall decisions in the plot end up remaining the same, though this does end up having a shake-up to his dialogue down the road, with him coming off a little bit more hostile if you do end up making him self-destruct in this instance, to where evacuate always felt like the better pick to me narratively here, and in essence it also ends up making Loaderbot's loyalty to you make full sense, even though from a more logical perspective, I guess you could say that self-destructing Loaderbot here is a correct call, and it killing off the other bandits to where they can't continue to chase you once you get into the building, which actually becomes kind of dumb that they don't. Anyway, we then reach the World of Curiosities, giving us a short explorable area that is essentially a straight line, which is kind of a common trend in this game, to where, again, straight up, the typical exploration that you would get from many other previous Telltale games is not really that focused on in this game, and it does feel like there are a lot of points where that they do throw in these like hallways for you to walk through simply to add more interactivity into the game and what is otherwise a very cutscene focused game, which also kind of becomes a trend for Telltale down the road. Though despite that, I do think this is a pretty interesting section here, with there being a lot of tension, with it very much feeling like a scene coming out of a horror movie, with there being many creepy exhibits that you walk past, where you very much do expect something to pop out at you eventually, which it does after you cross the Hall of Pandoran Luminaries. We do end up seeing some characters that are references to previous games, including Professor Nakayama, who was obsessed with cloning Handsome Jack, to where we end up taking his Hyperion ID chip, to where I wonder if that'll matter down the road. But this hallway ends up ending in a dead end, only for us to, on our way out, realize that one of the exhibits is missing, giving us a jump scare and Shade popping out at us, the owner of the museum, and also a character from Borderlands 2 that has no real effect on the story outside of just being a cool cameo for fans, which is obviously something this game does a decent amount of in the early portions of this season. But anyway, Shade ends up leading them to the meeting where we end up finally seeing August, who is there alongside his girlfriend Sasha, who ends up being a much more prominent character moving forward. But this can be a very awkward conversation, with August having expected Vasquez. So while you can talk your way out of that, you can also just give him cagey answers, like when he asks for your name, though here you can tell something is off with Sasha, with her staring at Reese at a point, and then proceeds to call off the deal, only for her to have a quick change of mind, which is a bit of cool foreshadowing there. You know, the thing that this is foreshadowing ends up being revealed like 10 minutes from now, but this ends up being really dumb that despite Sasha now wanting to do the deal, it ends up spooking August into not wanting to do the deal for some reason, just to add more contrived adversity, to where we do follow this up with our first instance of this game playing around with having this unreliable narrator, whereas August proceeds to leave. We can choose to either blow his mind or break his heart, both of which having these ridiculously over-the-top sequences of us taking August down and taking the vault key from him, only for us to hear Fiona's voice for first time saying, "What a steaming load of skag crap," taking us back to the present. Obviously exposing Reese for exaggerating in his story, but also now introducing Fiona to the story in a pretty apt way here, instantly bickering with Reese, with her obviously being the second playable character in this game. And despite her being a con artist here, she, like Reese, ends up ending up being another likable presence, having some insecurities that make her feel relatable, while also having high aspirations, as we'll later see, making her and Reese feel directly paralleled, and them being in similar places in life, despite the fact that they come from very different backgrounds. And again, like Reese, I do think her character is greatly booned by her voice actress, obviously being played by Laura Bailey, essentially the female equivalent to Troy Baker, and the fact that she's in almost every major game. Again, another staple of the video game medium. I do find it funny these are the two main voice actors for this game, considering the events of The Last of Us Part 2, but also, again, really cool to have two playable characters here. Again, another increase in scale for a Telltale game, where previous games outside of, I guess, 400 Days, only had one protagonist, while this game obviously has two, allowing for shifting perspectives that allows for more sophisticated storytelling in comparison to the previous games. But now with Reese and Fiona reunited in the present, with the kidnapper having also kidnapped Fiona, they end up obviously jointly telling the story from this point on, but clearly there ends up being this resentment between the two, again, setting up this mystery of why do they hate each other, which clearly turns out to be something not fully formed by the time episode 1 came out, where again, obviously this game does follow the 5-episode structure that Telltale is known for, which, while very good for developers and allowing them to get more funding between episodes, and obviously gives them more time to work from episode to episode, an issue that stems from how Telltale operates, the fact that it seems very clear that they very rarely ever have the full story fully plotted out by the time they start a game, where while they obviously must have this general outline of the story they want to tell, it does feel like there are many points across all their games where there are these minor details that feel very inconsistent, with them making changes on the fly, and through that, this is one of those, where this overall hatred between the two that we see in episode 1 here just makes no sense by the time we finish this game. But obviously this leads to Fiona telling her side of the story, with the reveal that she was actually there during the deal, with the entire situation turning into a complete mess, with the key turning out to have been fake, and multiple factions conveniently proceeding to show up. But before we get to that, we then go back to the beginning of her story, learning about her background, with again her being a con artist from Hollow Point, working alongside her adopted father and Felix, and her sister, who ends up being Sasha, again setting up her increased role in the story, with her now being the +1 character for Fiona in the same way that Vaughn is for Reese, but being a bit more integral to the overall plot, and also ending up being Reese's love interest, and again also being another likable figure in this game, being one a bit more competent than the likes of Reese and Fiona, but is portrayed by a Telltale veteran in Aaron Yvette, who had been in pretty much every Telltale game up to this point, training the likes of Molly in Walking Dead Season 1, Bonnie in Season 2, and probably her biggest role being Snow White in Wolf Among Us, to where, again, it should have been kind of expected for her to show up in this game. But here we do end up seeing them preparing for the biggest scam yet in selling this fake vault key, with us getting a short bit of gameplay and us walking to the bar where we plan on handing the key off to August, where beforehand Felix ends up giving Fiona a pistol with one bullet in it just in case of emergencies, which is a cool aspect of this episode, that you obviously have the choice as a player of when you want to use this bullet, which sadly gets dropped in following episodes. I think this would have been a cool thing to have as a season-long choice. Yet again, really only plays a factor in this one specific episode, and even then, barely factors into anything. But on the way to the bar, we do get introduced to the currency system in this game, where in the Fiona gameplay, you can find loot, which again perfectly fits in line with the Borderlands identity, though the main use of money in this game is to simply just buy skins that are also only able to be used at certain points in the story. That, again, it's kind of lame, though again, at least there is some sort of reward for exploring these areas. And interestingly, right off the bat, we do get a more interesting way to use money here, and us being able to bribe the bouncer to get into the bar, this bouncer being Hector Hodunk, another character from Borderlands 2. So it really ends up being the only time you really utilize your money through dialogue options, which I think is kind of wasted potential there. But whether you use money or not here, Sasha ends up letting you in anyway, where again, that didn't really matter. Where we do get another explorable area inside of the bar, while waiting for August, where Sasha will give Fiona the fake story that she's supposed to tell him, to which you can follow, though again, doesn't really matter if you do or not, so he'll believe you anyway, go through the deal, which is very strange considering the fact that they do set up August as this more menacing figure here, killing the guy that he was dealing with before we showed up, just for him to be easily tricked in this situation, where we even see him like reach out to touch the key, where you get this big decision of stopping him or not, where if he touches it, it ends up getting paint on his hands, which he just doesn't notice. But this leads to the day of the deal, with Fiona and Felix watching from afar, only from the panic when Reese arrives, with them realizing he has an echo eye, and through that would be able to scan the key and recognize that it's fake. Now leading to us playing as Fiona again as we try to scramble Reese's system by putting an EMP device on the case, giving us a monotonous puzzle here, trying to find our way to a ventilation shaft, which when there, we get jump scared by Shade once again, who we can choose to have accompany us here, though that doesn't really end up affecting the plot in any significant way, as it really only dictates whether or not he lives, a spot where he never shows up in this game again anyway. But obviously we get the reveal that Sasha's sketchiness during the deal was to get the case to Fiona, along with us also seeing the reality of the situation for Reese during his exaggeration, the fact that he actually just got on his knees and begged in a pathetic way, eventually getting August to agree, which again makes August's hesitance there all come off as really dumb. But either way here, at some point ends up getting revealed that the key is fake, with it ending up being dropped and breaking apart, again making this entire plot feel kind of pointless. But before we can deal with that, Bossa Nova crashes in, an over-the-top gang lord playing dubstep music, which again is so random here, and that's followed with the entrance of Zer0, the namesake of this episode, who ends up being another character from Borderlands. Doesn't really do anything in this episode, at least nothing of real significance, though we do see them fight for a brief second, with Reese cowering in fear, leading to Bossa Nova stealing the money and leaving, despite that not even being his goal of being here and him just stumbling onto the money, I guess. But this does lead to us escaping from August, with him obviously now knowing that this is all a scam, to where as we leave as Fiona, we do have the opportunity to shoot him with the bullet that Felix gave us, where if we do, we won't have the opportunity to use the bullet in a later situation, though again, it doesn't really matter. And also, who would have guessed, shooting it here leads to you hitting his hand, which again, doesn't matter. But now with all the main characters having escaped in Felix's caravan, we do see them initially be hostile towards each other, with Reese and Vaughn having attempted to steal the caravan to begin with, though we eventually see them reluctantly agreeing to form an alliance to recover the money from Bossa Nova, where Fiona can claim that they calmly discussed an alliance, when in reality Reese and Vaughn are threatened at gunpoint and were about to be thrown out, to where we do see Reese calling Yvette, who ends up refusing to help, only to be saved by the fact that they have the ID chip that they stole from Nakayama, which would allow them to get security clearance from Hyperion and track down the money, though when inserting the chip into his head, Reese ends up passing out, only to be awakened by a mysterious voice in his head that might be familiar to Borderlands fans, which again we'll obviously later talk about. But Following this, we do find the group having tracked down the money while he was unconscious, again, without his help, making the entire thing kind of pointless, but it does take us to an old Atlas facility overrun with Bossa Nova's gang, with them having taken it over. We do use the Echo Eye here to scan the area, though Reese ends up going over this fantasized plan in this really over-the-top way, only for it to turn out that the others have already found their way down, again minimalizing him once again in this spot, though right away we do see Reese and Sasha get separated from the other two, allowing for their characters to further bond, and this in particular starting their implied romance that doesn't really do that much over the course of the story. But here we do end up working together to take out some bandits, with her being a bit more successful, with her coming off as a competent fighter, while Reese struggles as expected, though ends up defeating his opponent due to his stun baton once again, with Sasha actually being impressed and wanting to see it, with her seeming to have an obsession over weapons, to where we can choose to trust her or not. Again, another choice that doesn't really matter outside of her just using the stun baton in the upcoming fight. So again, it can feel like we're bonding these two characters, even though the scene will play out similarly anyway, but it does lead to them sharing a bit about their backgrounds, seeing them discuss the differences between Helios and Pandora, with again this classism from those from Hyperion, along with the hostility the Pandorans have towards those from Hyperion, again ends up being a pretty constant presence in the narrative, despite not being that integral to the plot itself. But eventually we do get attacked by Skags, only to be saved by Zer0 for fan service, who ends up mentioning that he's on the search for the Gortys core, which I wonder if that has anything to do with the Project Gortys that the kidnapper was talking about. But with that, we do then cut back to Fiona, who alongside Vaughn ends up being stopped by a mask vendor, to where we end up convincing him that we are there to participate in the death rally, which is conveniently about to start, to where the mask vendor ends up selling us a mask, with one of them conveniently being free. Though again, you can spend money on a different mask if you want to. That all really changes the skin for the mask in the upcoming section, which is a pretty pointless choice. And we do follow this with a pretty weird scene of like Fiona trying to prop up Vaughn for the fight, to which she tells him to man up, and she can proceed to headbutt a psycho, which is all very strange. And again, I get that it's trying to highlight the differences between Hyperion and Pandora, yet this does feel a bit ridiculous. This does lead to another pretty massive action set piece, the final one for this episode, which has us switching back and forth between Reese and Fiona in what is essentially two separate set pieces, where Reese, Sasha, and Zer0 end up facing off against bandits and Skags in an arena similar to a coliseum, all while Fiona and Vaughn end up participating in the race and fight against bandits in a more chase-like sequence, feeling like it's directly pulled from Mad Max, being extremely cinematic in that way. But again, this does end up being a really lengthy section that can be a bit annoying, where straight up checkpoints in this game are pretty far apart, to where if you miss a QuickTime event that leads to your death, which again, just in general, obviously QuickTime events are not particularly difficult, but if you do miss any, it does make you having to waste minutes trying to get back to where you previously were, which is annoying. Though mid-fight, we do see Reese getting a call from Vasquez, who does end up giving us an offer to sell out Vaughn in exchange for being allowed back into Hyperion, which obviously I feel like most people are just going to say no to this, as for the player themselves, again, there really is no incentive for you to say yes, as clearly Vasquez is someone not to be trusted, though even saying yes here doesn't really even play a major factor into the story anyway. But the fight does follow a case of money, which starts off in the arena, to where we do see Reese using Zer0's sword to kill a Skag that ate the money, only for the money to then end up in the middle of the race with us chasing after it. Then we do get a choice at a point of helping Vaughn or going for the case, which again is cool on paper, but again, doesn't really matter, as either way, Felix will show up at the last second for him to grab the money, with him pointing his gun at Fiona, revealing that he's taking the money for himself, which feels like a really dumb plot twist, with this really coming out of nowhere, and it really just feeling like a way from the right amount of the story to add this illusion that your choices actually matter, where obviously Fiona ends up feeling betrayed by this. And we do get one of the few choices of consequence in this episode, in that the case of money ends up having a bomb attached to it, to where we do get the choice here of warning Felix about it or letting him die from its explosion, along with there also being an additional choice where if you still have your bullet from earlier, you can shoot it at him, only for it to not do anything anyway. And again, this ends up being a life or death situation for Felix, though like most Telltale games, even if he does survive here, ends up being written out, him only having minor appearances down the road, and even then how they handle his character ends up being very strange. But either way, the case ends up exploding with the money in it, aka nullifying the entire goal here of getting the money. Also, I should mention the fact that Zer0 does end up killing Basanova, because I'm sure you care about that. But the fight resolved and the money lost, we do see our characters walking through the rubble to find valuables, only for Loaderbot to finally return out of nowhere, with his dialogue again being different based on what you decide for him earlier. But his arrival ends up causing Reese to fall through the floor, conveniently landing him in an underground lab, which just happens to be there, and also conveniently ends up being the location of the Gortys cores that Zer0 was looking for, which again he had already given up on for whatever reason. But again, Reese and Fiona end up taking it for themselves, which in doing so ends up revealing the location of a vault, which finding it obviously ends up being our new goal. But the episode does end with this mysterious voice from Reese's head reappearing, with it being revealed to be the voice of Handsome Jack, now in the form of an AI, being this great reveal to end this episode with, again, taking a really iconic villain from the OG games and interjecting him into a major role in this game, using him to propel Reese's arc in the story, showing him the realities of his role model, but also Hyperion as a whole, and also allowing Handsome Jack to be utilized in a similar way to how he was used in Borderlands 2. Again, using him to taunt the player constantly, and with him also being played by his original voice actor and Damian Clark, it ends up giving Jack a pretty perfect role in this story, with his introduction here being a great cliffhanger for this episode. And with that, we do move on to episode 2, Atlas Mugged, another solid episode, the one that does feel a bit less grand than the other episodes, feeling like the shortest episode of the season, with not much narrative progression outside of introducing more characters to the roster, though still enjoyable episode through and through. And we do start off the opening narration with the narrator saying, yes, it's been a while, everyone knows. It actually ends up being a reference to this episode's release date, with this episode coming out 2 months after its initial planned dates, suggesting some development issues within Telltale, which to be fair is the norm for Telltale. But with that, I should mention the fact that this game does end up taking almost a full year to fully release, a much longer release schedule than previous Telltale games, where again these episodes end up being released with relatively large gaps in between episodes, again indication for troubles within development, which we'll expand on a bit later. But the episode does start with more bickering between Reese and Fiona in the present, only for us to return where we left off, with us getting the same scene from the end of the previous episode, but now from Fiona's perspective, where Jack is nowhere to be seen, with Reese being the only one to be able to see him, again making him look completely insane in this instance, and does end up taking him out of the picture for this next gameplay sequence, which ends up being a puzzle section of us having to find a way to use a nearby terminal, which needs a retinal scan, leading to us having to find General Pollock's body and use a spork to pull his eye out, which ends up being a really gruesome scene, especially considering the later reveal that he was actually still alive. But this ends up all revealing a video from another character from the OG Borderlands games, in Athena, who I'm sure will be just as irrelevant as the other dumb cameos we've seen. But this video ends up leading us to Old Haven, in Atlas mining town, where the Gortys project was hidden, which ends up being the end location for this episode. But as this is occurring, we do end up hearing noises coming from Reese, who ends up falling over the railing, which ends up being exaggerated by Fiona, and it causing a geyser of blood, taking us back to Reese's POV, showing us what really happened during that time, which is pretty much just comprised of him fighting with Jack, being an introduction to their dynamic, which is clearly a toxic one, with Jack attempting to strangle him, but can't, with his realization that he's simply just a hologram. But again, all this being what caused Reese to make all this ruckus that he was making earlier. Anyway, the group ends up getting attacked once again here, this time by Hyperion, with us having to escape in the caravan, leading to this action sequence shifting back and forth between the two characters, with Reese trying to drive the caravan and dodge the moonshots, all while monsters are chasing after us, with Fiona getting to shoot them down. And again, this being a pretty lengthy section, though through it we do get a minor choice here of Fiona getting to tell Sasha to either help her or Reese, which again doesn't really matter. And even then, I feel like most people would be picking Reese in that spot. But eventually we end up escaping after Reese pushes the boost button to drive past a monster ramming towards us, just as the moonshot hits that monster, leading to the opening credits with slow-mo shots as both Reese and Vaughn proceed to fall out of the caravan, separating the group once again, with us first focusing on Reese and Vaughn as they're now stranded in the desert, to where we do end up getting a call from Yvette, who once again doesn't help. And we do weirdly then proceed to get a joke about how ripped Vaughn is as he takes off his shirt, because I guess that's funny. But here Jack ends up making his reappearance, with Reese arguing with him in front of Vaughn, leading to Reese having the opportunity to tell him about Handsome Jack, which, considering some later events, is kind of dumb that we were given that opportunity here, but not given the opportunity to tell Fiona and Sasha at points where it would have been a lot more beneficial. But eventually a car ends up descending from Helios, with them instantly assuming it's Yvette coming to the rescue, but I mean, come on, that would be ridiculous. It's instead Vasquez who confronts them with a shotgun in hand, calling out Reese's deal, whether you made one or not. At least that's how you perceive it initially, until it's revealed that Vaughn was also offered the same deal and actually did take it. Which I think all this is really dumb. One, it feels very out of character for Vaughn to be taking this deal when otherwise he comes off as this very loyal ally. And a spot where, again, I feel like this was largely just done here just so that they didn't have the follow-up on the previous choice, as, again, it would make no sense for you to make a deal of Vasquez only for that to not show up again. So the way to minimize the impact of that scene is to make Vaughn accept that deal as well. Lessen the blow of taking the deal, where they only have to write one scene with Reese's deal never coming up afterwards, outside of dialogue options that hold no real weight in the main story. But Vasquez does end up giving them shovels here to dig their own graves, only for a fight to arise anyway, with Vasquez charging his gun, because he wants maximum damage, which is obviously the typical overconfidence from the antagonists, allowing for us to have time to use Reese's Echo Eye and have the choice of hacking into his shotgun or his car, either way knocking Vasquez down to where we see Jack pointing and laughing at him. Now noticing that this is forcing Reese's robotic arm to do the same, with this obviously being the reveal that Jack's starting to gain control over the mechanical aspects of Reese's body, which might be relevant later on, but eventually we do see Loaderbot once again coming to the rescue, because that's his role in the story. This does lead to us getting one of the few points in this game where you are given a choice that actually impacts how the episode plays out, feeling very reminiscent to choices that you would see in Wolf Among Us. And then we have the choice between two locations, picking which one we want to go to first, where here we can go to Hollow Point, Fiona and Sasha's hometown, which they had mentioned stopping by to get the scent off their back before heading to Old Haven, or we could just go straight to Old Haven. Again, a choice that doesn't have many long-term ramifications, though obviously your choice here will determine which section you play first, and will lead to some minor differences between the two. Where I do prefer picking Hollow Point first here. Again, it obviously adds camaraderie between the group, which, while again, not really reflected in the writing, I do feel like the player themselves feels more connected to this group when seeing them do things together. But no matter which one you choose, finally we get probably one of the most notable scenes of this game, perfectly fitting in line with the ridiculousness of this game's humor, and us seeing Vaughn apologize for taking the Vasquez deal, to which when doing so, he proceeds to end every sentence with bro, only for Reese to then do the same, leading to you being able to do a bro fist with Vaughn, and we see them proceed to just say bro over and over and over again, which is, again, a really over-the-top scene, obviously justified in-game as being an exaggeration from Fiona, even though she wasn't there. But again, a scene that just feels really stupid. And while, again, I probably would be annoyed at moments like this in most other games, I do feel like for this game, it feels kind of in line with this game's overall identity. But again, at this point, which section you play first is determined on the choices that you make. And through that, I'm going to talk about the Hollow Point path first, which puts us back in control of Fiona, as her and Sasha end up arriving at Hollow Point, where the opening sections of this section end up playing out the same no matter what previous choice you made, where now they have to go and fix the caravan while at Hollow Point, aka an excuse for why they don't go back and save Reese and Vaughn. But this has us going to Scooter's used car parts, where we meet Scooter, another character from the OG Borderlands games, but one that does play a bigger role than those previous cameos, with him appearing again down the road, and him once again coming off as a very likable, doofusy, gullible character that ends up agreeing to fix our caravan for free, with him recognizing Fiona from the death rally somehow, and wants to sponsor her, which, and she can't deny, as she should, considering she's a fugitive, and this will make it easier for her to get caught. But either way, he will end up agreeing to fix the caravan due to Sasha's later flirtation. And it's here we do get to use the Catch a Ride, another concept from the OG game, where these terminals allow you to customize your vehicle, thus getting to customize the caravan here, using money we picked up along the way, though again, that doesn't really matter. But eventually Scooter ends up getting a visit from Finch and Kroger, two bandits looking for Fiona and Sasha that end up being these reoccurring lackeys in this game, though funnily are actually voiced by Dave Fennoy and Adam Harrington, the voice actors for Lee Everett and Big B Wolf respectively, the main protagonists of Telltale's previous series, eyes, which is a cool little touch there, but Scooter ends up denying knowing Fiona and Sasha, to which they end up beating him for some reason before just leaving, which it feels like, again, them trying to make Scooter a more likable presence here. Following this, as we do wait for the repairs to be done, we do end up going to Felix's safe house to get supplies, only to find it having been already ransacked, but it does give us this explorable area, having to search for Felix's stash by finding a black light, which will uncover clues that I guess Felix left for us to find, which, again, doesn't really make sense if Felix is dead in particular, but we do end up finding a stash under secret board under a chair, where inside we find a message from Felix revealing that he left because he realized that they were messing with Valerie, a gang leader that ends up being a major antagonist down the road, though this obviously was meant to set up the threat level that she poses, while also this being the reveal that this was all a plan for him to distance himself from them to, I guess, keep them safe, I guess? None of this really makes sense, but they do try to make Felix this more sympathetic character at this point, when again, it really does feel completely nonsensical. But also inside the stash, we do end up finding 2 gift boxes, one for each of them, where inside of Fiona's is a upgrade to her pistol, adding elemental bullets for some reason, while also giving you a bullet in case you used one earlier to kind of reset that choice there. While Sasha ends up refusing to open her box, still being pissed over Felix's betrayal of them. So we do get the choice here of whether or not to open it for ourselves, a choice that, again, doesn't really matter. Though if we do open it here, we do end up finding a watch that reads, "Time heals all wounds," a phrase that will somehow actually be relevant later down the road. Eventually, Finch and Kroger barge into the room, taking us to a big action sequence to end this section, where we do get a very important choice here, which is to pick which type of bullet to use against Finch, which obviously isn't a major choice at all, but it does actually have some effect here, and the fact that depending on what shot you use, it actually ends up scarring Finch in a different way, giving him a different injury, meaning that he has a different skin moving forward based on what you use. So that's something. But eventually we end up getting chased down through streets of Hollow Point, where along the way we see Athena arriving, where again, surprising that she actually ends up being relevant here, but she ends up chasing after us, with her being given an evil voice that feels very strange. I don't know if that's part of the dramatization here, though. The way the fight ends up resolving here will end up being different based on a previous choice, where if Reese and Vaughn decide to go to Hollow Point, Loaderbot will end up coming to the rescue, because that's just what he does all the time. And with that, the group will end up reunited and end up heading to Old Haven together, with Reese declaring them as his friends, which Fiona can confirm back, while otherwise we end up escaping through a flash grenade we found in Felix's safe house, getting us back to Scooter's garage and meeting Janie Springs, a junk dealer working with Scooter, only to see Athena still chasing after them, with it being revealed that Athena is Janie's girlfriend, giving us the opportunity to tell Janie about Athena being the assassin that was chasing after them, leading to this weird relationship drama over how Athena promised to stop doing that line of work and her trying to keep her cover during this scene, leading to this tension between Athena and Fiona, to where you can just taunt her by taking her shield, where she can't obviously react to that due to Janie being right next to her, which again is a very weird choice that ends up not having much of a factor. But again, this ends up being a much more expanded scene than what you would get if you had chosen to have Reese and Vaughn go to Hollow Point. So while that feeling like the better option on paper, it actually leads to a less interesting resolution to this sequence. And really the opening of the Old Haven section isn't even that different based on how you play it. Now, again, the order will be switched around based on which one you chose, and if you went to Hollow Point first, you will have Fiona and Sasha there during the opening section, but otherwise, the following puzzle is exactly the same, ending up being a pretty mundane one where you just have to interact with 3 terminals around the area. That ends up being a pretty boring stretch of gameplay, all to reveal the entrance to the Atlas facility, which when we enter, we end up getting held at gunpoint by August, with the difference here is if you went to Old Haven first, it ends up happening outside the facility, and we eventually get caught up with Fiona and Sasha finding them, with them already being held up by August and Vasquez, while otherwise the group will enter together, only be held up by August and Vasquez once they entered the building. To where here we see them shut down Loaderbot and force Reese and Fiona to activate the Gortys cores, sending them down 2 separate hallways, allowing for conversations between Reese and Vasquez and Fiona and August, where during Reese's conversation, we again tell him we got this far because of our friends, all while Vasquez talks about his backstory backstory and him being inspired by Handsome Jack and how Jack would punch him in the face, which he took as a sign of affection, I guess, all while Jack struggles to remember his name until he remembers the nickname he gave him, which is Wallet Head, which we can proceed to use to taunt Vasquez, all while during the Fiona-August combo ends up doing a lot to again set up the threat that Valerie poses, and August talking about wanting to keep Valerie from killing him, considering we later find out that he's Valerie's son, which I guess does make her come off as more ruthless, but also to a kind of ridiculous degree at that point. But eventually we do see Reese and Fiona reach the center platform and connect their pieces, forming a metal ball that they almost drop, but in doing so it ends up activating the security system, culminating the episode in a final choice here, and Fiona and Jack having differing ways of getting out of this, and us having to choose which one to trust, with the episode ending just as the one that you choose ends up enacting their plan, which all of this should be a pretty obvious choice, but does play into a somewhat central conflict in the story of Reese's conflict between siding with his friends or with Jack, which isn't handled that well, though you can see sprinkles of this being meant to be the central dilemma to progress Reese's arc. That again ends up being not much of a dilemma to me. Where obviously you're going to side with Fiona over Jack, this tyrannical war criminal. I always found this to be kind of a non-choice from a moral perspective, but all this ends up ending the episode on a low point with our friends being held captive and Reese and Fiona's status being unknown, ending this episode on a new low for our characters, something that ends up being kind of a trend for each of the following episodes. With that, we get to episode 3, Catch a Ride, which ends up being another episode that is good, probably on par with episode 2, with it by the end really ramping up the story and progressing some character arcs, with this being a much more character-focused episode over plot-driven, which, while providing some strong character moments, I do think by the end I come out of it looking at the following episodes as a bit stronger. But the episode does start with this short scene in the present with the kidnapper questioning Reese about his decision at the end of the previous episode, where obviously then continue off that previous cliffhanger, where either way you end up escaping. Obviously the way that you do so is very different based on your previous choice, with going with Fiona has you sneaking your way through a hatch conveniently right under the platform that you were standing on, all while siding with Handsome Jack has you taking control of the bots and using them against August and Vasquez, both of these plans feeling very much in line with the characters that created these plans. Though I do find the Fiona side of things a bit annoying to play, where there is a section where you have to stealth through an area and avoid lasers, and considering the wonky checkpoint system, it can be just very tedious if you mistime it there. But eventually the entire group regroups in the middle of the crossfire, to which had you chosen to side with Fiona, Vaughn ends up getting paralyzed here, which again gets played up for humor down the road, though really I do feel like this is something that was simply just added in here to make it feel like your choices mattered, and also to potentially lessen the role of Chris Hardwick in the story, where he does become noticeably less prominent in episodes 3 and 4. Again, as expected, Loaderbot ends up carrying the group out of the facility because he needs to save them once again, only for us to instantly be shot down as we leave, with the Gortys ball rolling away until it's stopped by a mysterious figure, with that person turning out to be Valerie, who again was set up as this menacing villain in the previous episode, and our first interaction with her here ends up being one where she does reach out her hand to Fiona to help her up, which you can accept or refuse, though all of this really subverting your expectations here. They're instantly coming off not as antagonistic as you would expect her to be, though it is here where we see Finch and Kroger show back up, to which we do get to see the damage we did to Finch for the first time here, only for her to call them back after they start antagonizing Fiona, with her seeming to have a liking for Fiona, even though she proceeds to almost kill her. But here she does proceed to say that someone has to pay for her losing out on $10 million, with August and Vasquez conveniently showing up in this instance, giving Fiona the opportunity to blame who she wants to between these two, or even Felix. But no matter what, Valerie ends up killing Vasquez anyway, which is a shocking death for him to die this early on in the story, when he was such a fun villain in the previous episodes. Obviously they do find a way to bring him back in some capacity in the following episode, but obviously killing who had been the main antagonist before this ends up increasing Valerie's threat level here, making her feel like a much more formidable foe, which pays dividends in at least this episode, though this is followed up by another exaggeration from Fiona of her pretending like she went on to kill her, only for the reality to be her just struggling to say anything, only for her to now be saved by Athena, who ends up single-handedly knocking out all of Valerie's men here, and even knocking down Valerie herself, where Valerie proceeds to pull out a knife, which I don't know how she was planning on using that as we never see her do because August shows up telling her that we have to go. For some reason, that's literally never explained, especially considering she literally leaves here without Gortys for some reason. After she leaves, Athena ends up asking our group if they are all stupid, with the reveal that she's actually trying to help them in a spot where they thought the opposite, with her having taken up a contract, being from Felix, I guess, leading to Athena assisting us throughout this episode, with her acting as this mentor and older sister figure to Fiona in a spot where she aspires to be a Vault Hunter, which is a dynamic I do enjoy here, with it taking a previously established character and utilizing her to progress Fiona's arc, similarly to how Jack is utilized to progress Reese's, even though that one's done a lot more substantially. And again, with this one also being kind of short-lived, only really taking place over the course of this one episode. But after that, we do get introduced to another new character here, with Fiona being able to finally turn Gortys on, who does become sentient and becomes a member of our crew, with her obviously being the key to finding the vault that we desire. And we do learn that we now need to find her other pieces in order to do so, being the main driver for the rest of this episode. Though in general, Gortys, while being a character very necessary for the plots, I do actually find her to be a very fun character in her own right, with her having this childlike innocence and lots of humor stemming from that, with that instantly being characterized here, and us seeing her being excited to find her other pieces and trying to drag Vasquez's corpse, not knowing that he's dead. But also finally, she is voiced by Ashley Johnson, aka Ellie from The Last of Us, which again, I never would have guessed if I hadn't looked it up at some point. And again, it is very surreal that we do get these scenes between Gortys and the two main characters, which is essentially just Joel, Ellie, and Abby from Last of Us all talking to each other. But this is followed up by the episode's intro, giving us a montage of the group traveling together, with some time clearly passing during this as we head towards Gortys' next piece. But following this, we do get a conversation between Reese and Jack taking place on the roof, to where we see a more snowy climate. Obviously, we talk through the choice of picking him or Fiona at the end of the last episode. Jack scolding you if you didn't side with him, using bond status as a reason for why you should have sided with him. Though clearly, this is just a spot of Jack wanting to gain more control over Reese's body, which, I mean, is going to happen anyway. But here you can agree to a deal with Jack to become partners. Though again, none of this ends up really mattering, as you don't really actually have to fall through on any of this. But eventually do arrive at an Atlas biodome, the location of the rest of the episode, which I do like this section visually, having a completely different color palette to the previous locations in the game, and being a location filled with plantation that glows, that again adds this very cool, fantastical aesthetic here. But here we do get a section that I've always found interesting, of us getting to actually walk through this initial path as the others end up walking ahead of us, allowing us to really take in the new locale in a spot where this felt like a scene that could have typically been in a cutscene, yet I always appreciate the decision to actually allow us to play this opening section in this area. And along the way, we do actually get the opportunity to talk to Sasha, with that conversation obviously having a flirty tone with this episode, really progressing their potential romance. And beyond this, we do end up getting another explorable area, and us having to find a way to get through a blocked area to get into the building, which again, you can obviously have conversations with your crew, but the main way to progress here is by talking to Loaderbot and Gortys, who again end up having a pretty endearing relationship through this game, again being these two robots that clearly have this very tight relationship through their time together. But again, we end up having to ask Loaderbot to clear it away, because Loaderbot has to do everything. Once inside, we do switch to Fiona's perspective, where we do get another open area here, where we get to talk to their crew once again, and can also use our money to buy new skins for our crew, which doesn't matter, but clearly you figure out that there's someone living here, with us finding clothes and fresh fruit, to where eventually that person ends up showing up here, humorously being labeled as ? Though we end up learning that his name is Cassius, with him instantly coming off as this panicky figure, which again, we'll find out why later on. But he will end up getting into the good graces of our group if Vaughn is paralyzed, and him being able to heal him. But anyway, he will help us formulate our plan here, where we do have to find the Gortys piece that we're looking for, with Reese and Sasha going to turn off the security system, all while Fiona and Athena go to security upgrade, giving us two pretty strong character focus sequences here that we end up cutting back and forth between, where you see Reese and Sasha's section progress their relationship, with Reese clearly flirting with her, asking her about her relationship with August. Also, after seeing these flying jellyfish that you can label as romantic, it'll end up leading to some awkwardness between the two, but this does end up leading to one of the more notable sections of this game for me, of Reese being scared of heights, and the platform that they're on ends up collapsing, leading to him hanging on with Sasha hanging on to his feet, making it seem like this life or death situation, with this being played out in a melodramatic way, with Reese struggling to climb back up and Sasha saying that she won't make it, with her making it seem like she's sacrificing herself for Reese in this situation, which we do get the choice here of agreeing or disagreeing with her decision to let go. Either way, she ends up letting go, with Reese screaming out as if she's died, only to reveal that we're barely above ground. Being a nice moment between Reese and Sasha here. Again, this show seeming to have some care for Reese, of knowing about his fear of heights and her trying to make sure that he didn't fall. And she does end up bringing up the fact that she's not willing to sacrifice herself, which might be a bit of foreshadowing. But anyway, following this, we do end up getting a scene of Sasha looking at some flowers, where we can proceed to pick one and give it to her, adding this feeling like this is a date between the two, but this eventually turns into an action sequence. The jellyfish ending up attacking them, leading to them having to rush to the security tower, where once inside, we do get some tension over the jellyfish trying to break in, and we do get this pretty tedious matching minigame to shut off security, which when doing so, we learn about Cassius' real identity as an Atlas scientist, if that wasn't already obvious. But this section does end up ending with Reese taking a big fall, where had you previously trusted Jack, this leads to Jack saying that he'll take the wheel for a few, implying Jack having more control over Reese due to that decision. But while all that is occurring, we do occasionally cut to Fiona's side of the story, of her going into the bunker alongside Athena, allowing for progression for Fiona's arc here, with Athena again acting as a mentor for her, and Fiona taking the first steps into becoming a Vault Hunter, where we do see Athena giving Fiona advice as we come across a killer plant, which has us having to shoot its bulbs, which change color and are conveniently color-coded to the color of the element that we need to take it down with for some reason. And during the next encounter, we do also get to visualize the way that we want to take the plant down, feeling like the exaggerated takedowns from earlier, though actually becoming a reality here, with Fiona again becoming a pretty competent fighter, though I will say that while I do like having this progression of Fiona's arc, and like the way they end up tying this into the general premise of Borderlands and her wanting to be what you essentially play as in the main series, and again, I do think that's a cool use of this IP's identity, I don't necessarily love how it does seem to take away from just how normal and relatable Fiona felt up to this point, with this kind of transitioning her into more of an action hero at points, which again kind of takes away from what made her character likable to begin with, even though again in reality that only ends up really being the case for this episode and kind of a minor moment in episode 5, though we do end up getting a pretty fun character moment from her here, and them needing a retinal scan to enter the bunker, leading to the reveal that Fiona still has General Pollux eye in her pocket from the previous episode, being a funny quirk here that even Athena is disgusted by. And I should also mention the fact that Athena along the way will also get a call from Janie, to which the only reason I'm mentioning this here is because this somehow ends up being kind of relevant, potentially, based on choices down the road, despite it being such a throwaway scene in this spot. But once inside, we do find the Gortys upgrade after a bit of tension of us still waiting for Reese to shut down the security system, but obviously this ends up going through smoothly. Now, following this, we actually do briefly cut back to the present, where we get the reveal that they have found the same Gortys upgrade in the present, being what the kidnapper was supposedly looking for. And also in a previous scene, we do see Fiona questioning the kidnapper, thinking that he must know them in some way, setting up the later reveal that this character is someone that we already know, which should have been obvious, though I do think with this game taking from the Borderlands IP, I do remember there being this worry that this would be some random character from a previous game that would simply be there for fan service, though thankfully the setup that they do here does end up quelling those initial worries. But eventually the group does come back together, where again, had you previously trusted Jack, Reese will be taken over by Jack in this scene and be a dick to the other characters and proceed to just out Cassius' true identity, which ends up coming out anyway, even if you do get the other path, which is kind of dumb, though, with Athena having a vendetta against Atlas and wanting to get revenge for her sister, having killed anyone involved with the company beforehand, we do see that as the reason why Cassius was so nervous, and this now giving us a choice here of either supporting or stopping Athena from killing Cassius. Again, a marginal difference here, particularly revolving around Vaughn and his trajectory moving forward. So no matter what you choose here, Athena ends up being stopped either way by the arrival of Valerie and her men, taking us to a pretty lengthy action sequence to find final one of this episode. It plays out very similarly to the death rally of it shifting perspectives and it going on for a while, but it does start with Rick, another character from the OG Borderlands games, bursting into the room and starting a fight with Athena, all while Valerie ends up shooting at the group with a rocket launcher, splitting them up with Reese and Sasha, ending up confronting August, who is chasing after Gortys, to which she ends up merging with her upgrade, giving her big legs to run with, only for them all to be captured anyway, with us also losing Vaughn along the way, which I'm sure means we'll never show up again. And again, straight up, depending on your choice with Cassius earlier, Vaughn can just straight up not even appear until episode 5, which is kind of dumb that that specific choice matters that much to Vaughn's appearance in episode 4, but again, who cares, as even if Vaughn does show up in episode 4, he really does nothing anyway. And again, while this is happening, we also have Fiona ending up encountering Finch and Kroger once again, while also later fighting against Mordecai, another OG character. And again, we end up seeing her fighting on her own for first time, utilizing the skills that Athena taught her earlier, with Fiona again coming off as a pretty competent fighter in a way that kind of took away from her character. We do end up seeing her falter by the end, with her almost shooting Valerie down, only for her to be trapped under her gun instead. And also get this moment of her trying to hand Athena her shield as there's missiles near her, only for us to end up distracting Athena instead, leading to Athena getting captured here, weirdly bleeding into the events of an entry of the main series, the pre-sequel, with them assumedly being developed side by side, with Tales starting to get released just after the pre-sequel's initial release. So again, you would assume that there would have been connective tissue between these two entries, to where again, you would think this connection here would have been planned, but through that ends up essentially writing out Athena from the following episode, and really most of the story moving forward. And we do end this episode with Valerie asking Gortys where the final piece that she needs is, with the reveal that it's conveniently in Helios, which, straight up, I do find this to be a near perfect ending to this episode. The group outright being defeated here, being this new low point for the characters, and them all being captured now by Valerie, feeling very reminiscent to the end of episode 2 of The Walking Dead season 2 in that light. And again, setting up this mystery of how are they going to get out of this sticky situation, while also again having this intriguing premise for the following episode, and us now having to go to Helios to get this final piece. Again, feeling this natural endpoint for this episode to where it doesn't sap the story of any of its momentum, while still keeping the intrigue that makes you excited for the next episode at the same time. But with that, we get to episode 4, Escape Plan Bravo, which ends up being a really strong episode here, where really the last 2 episodes end up being 2 of my favorite Telltale episodes. This one feeling somewhat reminiscent to episode 4 of The Walking Dead season 1, and that a bulk of this episode ends up being focused around this heist that ends up allowing for these great character moments, while also setting up the endgame events, allowing for it to remain focused while still progressing the plot and the character arcs in a satisfying way. But it is here where I do want to go back to talking about this game's development issues, to where, despite the fact that this game did very well critically and was well received by fans, that sadly did not translate to sales, where from a financial standpoint, this game was looked at as a failure amongst the Telltale catalog, where it seemed like this game was in serious consideration to be cancelled midway through, with the series seemingly being saved by the fact that the higher-ups agreed to allow just a skeleton crew to work on the last couple episodes, which, considering that fact, it is a miracle that these episodes end up being as strong as they are. Again, being 2 of the strongest episodes in any Telltale game, which in itself can be looked at as a commentary on the issues with Telltale, as, again, I do think a major reason for their later failures, but I just feel like there are too many cooks in the kitchen, and higher up simply had no clue what they were doing with the company, again, leading to these messy development cycles. And I think the fact that this game, again, finishes strong despite being developed in a way kind of against the way that Telltale typically developed its games is kind of an indication of why these last 2 episodes end up being as strong as they are, as again, it essentially becomes a passion project. As again, the people that remained on working on this game were people that were genuinely passionate about this project, and you could tell the level of care they put into these final episodes, where again, I definitely will have nitpicks about these along the way, but again, these episodes do end up being a lot better than they have any right to be. But we do start in the present with a ridiculous scene here of Reese trying to escape, running away in a zigzag motion, which is a really weird scene here. You play as Fiona and you do have the option to join him, but either way you end up getting recaptured due to there being a meteor storm that stops you. The kidnapper ends up retying you up and proceeds to beat up Reese, which felt pretty brutal considering who kidnapper ends up being. But anyway, we return to where we left off in the past, thus still being held captive by Valerie, with her getting Gortys to reveal that once completed, she'll be able to summon the Vault of the the Traveler, a vault that normally teleports across the universe, moving every few minutes, but Gortys can actually make it stay in place, obviously adding this uniqueness to the vault that we're trying to find here. But again, we still do need to find that final piece up in Helios, and more importantly, Valerie needs this final piece as well, being the only reason she doesn't kill the main characters in this spot, now tasking them with this heist mission of going up into Helios and stealing the piece, which ends up being the bulk of this episode, which again is an aspect of it I do like. I do really like this being a mission that involves the entire group, them all playing their role in a similar way to how the Crawford section, Walking Dead Season 1 plays out, though, again, it does feel very convenient that she doesn't just kill us in this spot, but I guess it makes sense considering Reese's connections to Helios, and Fiona and Sasha's skills as thieves, and she already has them captive anyway. But again, you would think that she would pick someone that she could actually trust. But anyway, the group ends up being transferred over to the caravan, where they end up coming up with the plan, with Jack now conveniently telling us that the beacon we are searching for is inside of his office. So we now know where we need to go, though this does lead to Sasha and Fiona questioning how did we know this? Which is where we finally get the choice of telling them about Handsome Jack. Which again ends up being a central issue in the conflict between Reese and Fiona in the present. So if Reese never told her, that would kind of make sense of why she is so upset. Still a bit harsh, but in the situation where you do tell them, Fiona still is upset at you, I guess. Again, holding resentment for you in the present, which again, I just find that to be really dumb, which again, determined on later events, again, she should be able to know how this conflict turned out for him, but also, something I do think is really dumb is the fact that we don't actually get the opportunity to tell them until now, a spot where, when knowing how much weight Reese puts into these relationships based on previous choices, I do think it is dumb that you don't have the opportunity to tell them before this scene, and again, obviously the reason for that is because they wanted this contrived reason for why they hate each other in the present. But again, that doesn't really make sense. And again, this all really does feel like a retcon. It does feel like there was a grander reason for why they hated each other in the present from the offset, though they end up changing the story along the way. But them feeling like this was justified enough, though for me it just comes off as really ridiculous. With this all just feeling like a spot where they stripped choice away from the player to shoehorn in this rivalry between them in the present. But obviously here we do still go over the plan, finding out that Jack's office is now a stop on the Handsome Jack tour, which I don't even get how this exists. It's very strange to me that Helios had been portrayed before this as this base of operations, this workplace, but then now we're getting Helios being set up as a tourist location. But either way, we do see them talk through the plan in the typical OTT way, with them planning to get Scooter to make them a spaceship, I guess, and get Yvette to help them sneak in, because that's something Yvette would definitely do. And then we have Fiona taking place of a tour guide, all while Reese will disguise himself as Vasquez to get himself in and pretend that he had killed Reese in delivering Reese's dead body, which will really be Vasquez's, which again, I'm sure will all go according to plan. But with that, we do get these individual Reese and Fiona sections as they do their share of the setup. First seeing Fiona go with Sasha and August to Scooter's garage, where this sequence doesn't really matter that much. No matter how much you screwed over Scooter previously, he ends up not caring, or I guess just not recognizing it. But he does obviously instantly agree to help us, despite him not knowing how to make a rocket. But this is where Janie Springs comes back into the story, or comes into the story for the first time based on your previous choices, as again, it is very possible for you to never meet her in episode 2, but again, this interaction can be a bit frosty had you lied to her about Athena earlier. Also, if you never ended up meeting her earlier, she'll somehow strangely recognize you from your voice being in the background when Athena called her back in episode 3, which is like, how? Again, that feels like such a contrivance, but we do get to tell her what happened to Athena and tell her that she loved her or not, which again ends up being implied that this choice will determine if Springs helps you or not, though again, it doesn't really matter. As for the Reese side of things, again, if Vaughn is in this episode, which again would be based around the Cassius choice, again, you would be able to have a conversation with him, with Vaughn ending up staying on Pandora, because he's Valerie's collateral, I guess, aka just a reason to write him out of the story. But the Reese section does have us going back to Old Haven, with Finch and Kroger escorting us to find Vasquez's body, where we end up walking down the street alone for some reason, eventually finding his body, only to find his face ripped off, which is so messed up. But while the gag of Vasquez's face being ripped off is notable, it does go on for a bit too long, where you scan numerous groups of psychos, though obviously it does lead to us having some one-on-one time with Jack, with him taunting us the entire way, trying to convince Reese that he needs him to climb up the Hyperion ladder, obviously being set up to the later choice that Reese has to make at the end of the episode. But eventually we do end up finding the psycho that has Vasquez's face on it. We do get this really messed up scene as we try to rip it off of his face. It does lead to the psycho chasing us down, with Reese doing his usual exaggerations, saying that there were thousands chasing after him, aka one. But either way, Finch will end up easily killing the psycho here when we get back to him, making you question, why didn't Finch and Kroger just go with us? Especially considering, like, Reese could have just ran away, but either way. We end up regrouping at Scooter's garage, where we do have Fiona being given money to buy Hyperion costumes, which again, the one that we choose doesn't matter. But we do see Reese using Vasquez's face here to become Vasquez, including the return of Patrick Warburton to voice him, which was a nice callback here. Oh, well, we finally get our intro to the episode as the group boards the ship with this overdramatic slow-mo as they walk out of the garage, giving us this humorous moment of Reese and Sasha smiling at each other, with Fiona end up blocking their view and staring back at him, only for Scooter then awkwardly stare at Fiona. After they lift off, we do get this pretty strong moment for Fiona and Sasha as they look back at Pandora, following up on all the comments Fiona had previously made about getting them off of Pandora, all while we do see Scooter wanting to promote his franchise by sending out a satellite, only for August to reject this plan, as it does put a bigger bullseye on their backs, only for us to be given the choice of whether or not to support him, which again, outside of upsetting Scooter and feeling bad for him, this specific choice doesn't really matter. But eventually, when looking outside, we do see Henderson's body still floating around, just for it to get sucked into our booster, leading to the ship being critically damaged, which I do like this callback to episode 1 here, it actually ending up affecting the plot to some degree. But we get a gameplay section here, playing as Fiona, where we go alongside Scooter and us having to climb around the ship, have to push a button and turn a latch to dislodge the boosters before they explode. And after we do our side, we get the reveal that Scooter sucks and failed on his side, getting his arm stuck with the panel shutting on him, giving us this really melodramatic moment as he tells Fiona to pull the latch anyway and cut him loose, which is obviously portrayed as this big sacrifice for Scooter and is a sorrow moment for the story, with Scooter again coming off as this really likable doofusy character, with him dying here in a spot where he's trying to help out our crew, even though he's probably only really doing that due to his attraction to Fiona and also wanting to promote his business. But again, it is sad when that actually doesn't really affect the main narrative that much, with this kind of feeling like a slight deviation here, and Scooter just in general being kind of a superfluous character to the story. But again, his death here does add stakes to the overall mission, and being a pretty brave choice to kill off a character that was actually in the original games, again, to kill him off in a Telltale game here, again, is something that I'm surprised Gearbox actually allowed them to do. And as a farewell to him, Fiona can choose to kiss him, which leads to her kissing him on the cheek, and following his death, we do get the choice of launching his satellite or not, which, again, plays minor dividends down the road. But then we switch back to Reese's perspective as we arrive on Helios, with him starting to pretend to be Vasquez to get permission to dock, to which when we do, we end up exiting with a cooler with Reese's name on it, which is ridiculous. Though here we end up talking to the guard captain, with Reese instantly coming off as OTT in his portrayal of Vasquez, again making these like homophobic jokes, which is just very strange. And finally, he does get instantly called out for it. But here we do end up being ordered with verifying what he was doing on Pandora, with them proceeding to put a gun to his head, with them being suspicious of him arriving in Pandoran trash. And they can obviously see Scooter's satellite if we launched it, which again, kind of surprising that it's this harsh when, again, supposedly Vasquez is supposed to be a higher up in Hyperion. But either way, we end up being saved here by Yvette, actually being useful for once. Though, clearly Yvette doesn't recognize it's actually Reese, fully thinking that he did kill Reese, saying it wasn't meant to go down like that, only to then mention their deal. And more so being upset at the death of Reese because of them losing the info in his head, more so than actually caring about his well-being, being this reveal that Yvette betrayed us. I can't believe it. She was such a good ally. Anyway, we find our way to Vasquez's office, where we do get a hacking minigame to hack into Hyperion systems, though we do end up struggling with it until Jack comes along, to where we work together to finish it, where this obviously shows him having a vested interest in this and obviously trying to keep Reese on his side. But this is allow Reese to guide the others through the station, getting them to the hub of heroism, essentially just the main plaza that is aptly named, where we do play as Fiona, where we now have to have her steal a tour guide badge, allowing us to explore this area, where we do get to talk to our crew and pickpocket a random dickhead for whatever reason. But eventually we do spot the tour guide, to where we do proceed to swipe her badge while Sasha distracts her, though obviously things go wrong with the badge being tapped to her hip, only for the situation to be rectified in the most ridiculous way possible, of Gortys accidentally spilling coffee on her, and the momentum of Fiona letting go of the badge is enough to swing it all the way to Sasha, where she catches it, and she hands it off to Fiona by sticking it on Gortys's back, which is all, again, a ridiculous sequence. But it does allow Fiona to reach Jack's office, only to find a group already there, ready to go on the Handsome Jack VIP tour, with those joining wearing Handsome Jack masks, which is weird, but leading to the fanaticism that Hyperion seems to have for Handsome Jack. But this does lead to Fiona reluctantly leading the tour, obviously having us make stuff up along the way, as obviously Fiona doesn't know what she's talking about here, and the tone of how you talk to them can change based on your dialogue options. But no matter what, your cover ends up eventually being blown, with it turning out that we weren't even showing off the exhibit at all, with the real office still being ahead, only for us to see that the real office is blocked off by a force field that instantly kills those that touch it. Where here we do have the choice of stopping or letting the tour group go. Either way, at least one person will be killed here because of plot. But again, it is possible to kill the entire tour group here. But obviously all this is just a really comical scene used to highlight the idiocy of Hyperion and their blind idolization of Handsome Jack. But because of someone being killed by the force field, the office is now put under lockdown to make this more difficult, being an instant snafu to our plan, with Reese not being able to break through it. And either way, now gets confronted by a vet who knows that Reese's body wasn't in that cooler and proceeds to call security, to where we do have the choice here of being able to talk it out with her or stunning her. Or if you actually trusted Jack earlier, you can use Dumpy, the robot that you took control of back in Old Haven, to attack her. Either way, at this point, we do learn from Handsome Jack that there is a trap door in his office that leads to the prison level, meaning that our plan is to now reach the prison level and be able to climb up through the trap hole, to which while Reese can get to that level on his own, Fiona can't. Meaning that we tell Fiona to get arrested instead of just meeting up with her and going with her. But either way, as Fiona, we do have the choice here between two ways of getting arrested here, either by shooting Jack's unicorn statue or by ripping down his mural, the former of which leading to a weird development in that the statue will start bleeding, obviously implying that the unicorn's actually alive. Again, none of this actually gets properly followed up on. But this does take us to one of the most notable scenes in the game, where we see Reese entering the hub of heroism, where, I mean, if Vaughn didn't show up earlier in the episode, he can briefly call you here just to remind you that he's alive. But again, for what actually makes this scene great, I will mention the fact that there was a lot of setup actually beforehand, where in previous sections where you're walking through Hyperion, even back to episode 1, you can constantly see Hyperion employees shooting finger guns at each other, with this feeling like the culmination of that setup, and us seeing the accounting department confront Vasquez, being upset at the $10 million that he lost, to where this leads to this really massive, over-the-top, ridiculous finger gun fight, taking us throughout the entire plaza, being presented in a really cinematic and stylish way, feeling like something you would expect out of a big budget action movie, but it instead just being Reese dressed up as Vasquez shooting finger guns at other Hyperion employees and then proceeding to play dead when they assumedly get shot, with the entire plaza being in on this, with it just feeling like the typical culture of this company, which is so stupid and so absurd. And, well, I typically would probably hate a section like this in the modern day. I do feel like this very much worked in this game and in this franchise, with it feeling in line with the tone of the game up to this point and also being in line with this game's themes. Once again, showing this enormous, monopolistic company being run by children. Again, playing into the absurdist nature of this game. And again, this ends up being one of the most notable scenes in this game, despite the fact that it's completely irrelevant to the actual plot. We're considering the number of development issues that this game had. I feel like it's kind of a miracle this actually made the final cut here, and again, just really shows developers being very passionate about making this scene a reality. But following this, we do reach the prison, where we do reunite with Fiona, finding her held captive alongside Gortys, with Gortys instantly blowing our cover here, calling us Reese, to where we do have to cover that up and proceed to strong-arm the guard into leaving, allowing for us to get to the trapdoor unfettered. Though once there, we do see it fortified with saws and spikes, giving us a short gameplay section of having to disable them, which is literally just done by pulling down the lever in front of us, only to find out that conveniently the lever needs to be held down to remain in place, which again ends up being this contrived way to make it so that Fiona can't help us within Jack's office. But with that, we finally get to Jack's office, with Jack being excited to be back in his office, or our office as he later says, talking about how they make a good team, where this is really where Reese's character and his arc really comes to head, where you do have the choice between agreeing with him or calling him out, saying that Hyperion Hyperion is just filled with assholes, and him saying that he doesn't know how he stood it for so long. Or again, that shows development from Reese, if you pick those choices at least, but the way to progress is clearly to go over to Jack's trophy case, where we do get a range of relics, with us having to find out which one is actually the beacon, with us showing Gortys our guesses until he confirms the right one, and this leads to us having to get back in Jack's chair to progress to open the trap door, something that is clearly symbolism here, again feeling like the culmination of Reese's attempts to mirror handsome Jack, and him even saying feels good as he does so, which I don't love, as again I do think that feels inconsistent with Reese's potential previous statements. Again, this very much feels like he still wants to be in Jack's place, which in that scenario, it feels like he wouldn't be. And again, we also get inconsistent following dialogue options as well. With him even being able to say that it just feels like a goddamn chair. Which, why are you saying feels good when you sit down in it then? But again, all this is just clearly Jack trying to manipulate Reese, saying that they can share the power that he had when he was in this room. But before we follow that up, we then cut back to Fiona for a short bit here, with us getting impatient at holding the lever, where we end up hearing Gortys in the distance talking to somebody, where now Fiona conveniently realizes that she could just hold up the lever by using a nearby broom, but she does go to check the commotion, with her finding out that Gortys is being interrogated by Yvette. I can't believe it. She's back in the story again. And that she's also captured Sasha, who just disappeared from the story after we took the badge, but this obviously setting up this darker ending for this episode, with the gang being captured again for the third time. But we get our final cut back to Reese here, where we are given the final choice for this episode, one that actually does feel pretty integral to the story, one that does actually shake up some sequences in the following episode, even though the story concludes in the same way anyway. But again, this is a pretty major choice for Reese's development, where you get to choose between ruling Hyperion or rejecting Hyperion, where in general, I do think Telltale Games are obviously typically promoted as you get to create your own story by making your own choices, and there isn't necessarily a wrong decision, and it's up to you. But I mean, with this game, I do feel like there is a pretty solid decision here, especially in these dilemmas surrounding Jack, where I do feel like siding with Jack in the story does very much minimize Reese's arc in my mind. It makes it feel not as consequential, where later, where he realizes what he did wrong and how he needs to change from that, it feels like that was an observation simply made because it was forced upon him due to Jack betraying him over something that he naturally came to through his experiences with the likes of Fiona and Sasha, which again, I feel like that is the more satisfying way for him to develop in this spot. But again, choosing the rule Hyperion has us agreeing to using the executive override port to transfer Jack's consciousness into Helios, to where he proceeds to announce to the entire station that Reese is the new president in town, with Fiona and Sasha being shocked to hear this. Where, again, in this world, I do think it makes a lot of sense why they are upset at Reese, with them thinking that he gave up on them in exchange for taking control of Hyperion, though again, even then, it doesn't fully make sense by the end, and really does not make sense in the other scenario, where otherwise you could pick the reject Hyperion, which has you rejecting to utilize the override port, only for Jack to force it upon you anyway, with the tone of the scene ending up radically different, and again, to me, gives Reese a much better character arc. But again, either way, Jack ends up uploading himself to Helios, in this spot seizing control solely for himself, never implying Reese's involvement, which makes you again question why Fiona is upset at him down the road. But again, this ends up being a great culmination to the episode, feeling like this new low point for the story, with handsome Jack, no matter what choice you end up making here, taking control of Helios, and Fiona and Sasha being captured, being a solid cliffhanger to lead us into the final episode, that episode being episode 5, The Vault of the Traveler, the only time the title actually relates to the actual events of the episode, over just being movie references. But as for the episode itself, it ends up being a really strong finale here, being a near perfect finale, from a plot perspective at least, wrapping up the characters' arcs in a really satisfying way, having mostly satisfying resolutions to the season-long storylines, and having a darker tone that feels appropriate to match the weight of the narrative that has been built up to this point. Though the episode does start with Fiona's POV, with her and Sasha and Gortys still being held up by Yvette, where you do get the choice to punch her, or at least when to punch her, as you have to punch her no matter what, finally leading to the caption at the top saying, "Yvette's face will remember this." But overall, a short scene here to start off the episode that did feel weirdly tacked on here, with it very much feeling like a more subdued scene to start off this final, grander episode with, but considering everything that later goes down, I don't know when else you would really fit this into the story. But anyway, now we do get back to where we left off with Reese, obviously in Jack's office, with it starting off very different based on the decisions you made at the last episode, where choosing to rule Hyperion leads to you actually working alongside Jack initially, getting to exert his power by destroying a bandit camp, or firing the accountant department, or ordering a pizza, only for Jack to go to the extremes when enacting these, destroying Prosperity Junction, again a full town, or killing the entire accounting department, which clearly shows their partnership going wrong, leading into the reveal of an endoskeleton that Nakayama made for Jack's consciousness to enter, with the reveal that he wants to use this endoskeleton to take over Reese's body, which in this spot is a just outright betrayal of Reese. So despite Reese doing everything he wanted him to do up to this point, it again feels like this is kind of the start of the turning point for Reese that causes his development, which again, it's like, why'd it have to go this far? Oh well, if you pick the reject Hyperion path, Jack's plan is obviously the same, though obviously he remains antagonistic towards you from the very beginning, with us getting an action sequence as we attempt to escape from him, after he attempts to cut us open, feeling like a scene from a horror movie, only for us to be able to sneak our way to the trapdoor, grabbing the beacon before making our escape, though we do follow this up with a little bit of a difference based on your previous choice, where if you had rejected Hyperion, you end up catching up with Fiona and Sasha before they end up leaving the prison level, allowing for a minor shakeup to the following scene, even though you end up meeting back up with them during the escape anyway. But either way, again, them even seeing you extra time in this spot where you had rejected Hyperion makes it that much more questionable why they were upset at you. But anyway, no matter what we chose previously, we do have an opportunity to talk to Yvette for what is definitely going to be the last time, with her being locked up by Fiona and Sasha, and us being given the choice here, freeing her or leaving her to die, which again won't really matter as she doesn't really do anything of significance beyond this, outside just showing up in random scenes, where again I'm sure she'll be very helpful. But either way, after this escape sequence, Reese does end up reuniting with Fiona and Sasha briefly to give them the beacon by sliding it under the closed door, again having them part in seemingly good terms, with this happening in both paths, to where again it makes it just feel inconsistent with the present. But this does also lead to Reese going to the power core to shut it down, to open the hangar doors so that they can escape, with Jack having put Helios under lockdown. But also in doing so, Reese does intend on sending Helios on a collision course in the attempt to stop Jack, who proceeds to order everybody to find Reese. But it does lead to a short gameplay sequence of Fiona walking down the hallway, because we need to add gameplay at some point in this episode. But at the end of the hall, we do see Jack taking over all the TV screens, allowing him to do what he does best in taunting and threatening her, only for her to not tell him anyway, and for him to send the elevator of guards after her, only for the reveal that they've been killed by August, because I guess he's finally useful. But with that, we cut back to Reese, now at the main power core, as we get more hacking minigames that don't end up being effective, leading to Reese getting this very action hero style moment here of him climbing down the core and smashing it piece by piece with his stun baton, which ends up opening the bottom vent for some reason, where we see Reese barely hanging on, and again, if Yvette is there, you can save her, only to proceed to destroy the last piece of the core, which conveniently closes the vent for some reason. So in this moment, we do see the caravan flying to Pandora, with Reese thinking that Fiona must have betrayed him, which is a good enough explanation for Reese's hatred of Fiona in the present, thinking that she left him for dead. But this all leads up to us cutting back to Fiona, with her now at the hangar bay, with her attempting to get into the caravan, only for Fiona to actually also be betrayed here, with Finch, Kroger, and August all taking the beacon and Gortys from her, though we do see August having a last second change of mind for some reason, really just to make him an ally later on, where he ends up helping us fight back, only to get shot in the shoulder conveniently, and again this leads to this big gunfight with Finch and Kroger, only for Finch to end up stealing the caravan with Sasha and August inside of it, again leaving Kroger for dead. All this obviously explaining why we see the caravan in the previous scene, meaning that Reese's side of that conflict is a complete misunderstanding. But either way, Fiona ends up being left behind here alongside Loaderbot, and she ends up escaping through an escape pod, which in the process you can shove someone out of the way, which is funny. But we do see Loaderbot seemingly on a mission here to save his friends, telling Fiona to keep Gortys safe as she leaves, which I wonder if that promise will matter later. But we do do see him proceed to rescue Reese here as well, and Yvette if she's there. All while we have Jack taunting them, telling them that all the escape pods are gone, only for there to conveniently be only one left, where if Yvette is alive here, we end up letting her take that pod. Otherwise, a random Hyperion employee will get it instead. But this is where Kroger finally shows back up, again adding more tension in this escape sequence for Reese, with us eventually finding a broken escape pod, obviously being Reese's assumed final chance for survival, giving us this great moment for Loaderbot and him sacrificing himself to make sure Reese escapes, where we do see Kroger seemingly destroying Loaderbot as Reese launches off, where we see him barging on the doors as he mourns for Loaderbot here, all being a very dramatic moment. Sure, again, it's a miracle that this game actually made me feel sad about the death of a robot. This once again feeling like another low point for our characters, finally giving us the title sequence of this game as each of our characters are alone as they fly back to Pandora with the song Retrograde by James Blake playing in the background, which is a song that always sticks in my mind when I think of this game, with it perfectly fitting into the somber tone of this sequence with Helios, again, being fully destroyed, the status of numerous characters being unknown, with Loaderbot having been implied to be destroyed, and for all this to happen before the actual title sequence is pretty insane, again, giving us this really dark tone to the introduction of this episode that doesn't necessarily end here. As we do follow this up with Reese arriving in Pandora, conveniently next to the wreckage of Helios, but I do love this sequence here, where we do have Reese slowly walking through the wreck, heading towards Jack's distorted voice, where we do get this great moment where we can walk up to the same Handsome Jack poster we posed in front of in the beginning of the game, only for this time to have Reese do the same pose as last time, but be dejected after he does so. And we also get this like massive Handsome Jack statue crumbling as we pass it to where it almost crushes him, obviously all being very symbolic of Reese's overall state of mind at this point, which, while I do think the Refuse Hyperion choice is better for Reese's overall arc, I do think the end portions of this game do play a lot more into the Rule Hyperion choice, with this sequence in particular being very much booned by that decision, where in this world, Reese had only cared about ruling Hyperion up to this point, where despite how terrible he had seen them to be, he still chooses to take control of the company. But now with Helios crumbled around him, it does feel very symbolic of Reese's world shattering around him, and showing the destruction that siding with Hyperion caused. Now, again, for Reese's character arc, I do think it is better for him to recognize this through his adventures with Fiona and Sasha, but I do think for this one specific moment, it does end up being more impactful if you choose to side with Jack. Even though, again, I do think it minimizes his arc, making it feel like he chose to eventually reject Jack and Hyperion just because of everything else failing around him. But again, we do reach the remains of Jack's office, finding Jack glitched out on the screen, with Reese joking that he's gonna give him the "we're not so different, you and I" speech, only for Jack to proceed to say that Reese is actually better at killing people than he is, and that you think you're the good guy in this scenario. Again, all of it feeling like it's really hammering home just how far gone Reese went, and again, it only makes sense in the situation where you rule Hyperion, even though dialogue shows up in both situations. But following this, we do get this attempt to make Jack sympathetic and regurgitating his relation with his daughter and talk about how much he had lost, making it seem like he knows it's over for him, only for Jack to be Jack, and this instead be lulling Reese into a false sense of security, sneaking behind him and using the override on Reese, putting him back in Reese's head, leading to our final confrontation with Jack, where he tries to choke Reese out here, taking control of his cybernetic arm, and now being willing to kill Jack, even if it means killing himself, with all this being a very brutal scene, showing Reese have to essentially dismember himself, showing Reese brutally piercing his arm through some rebar and then ripping it off, to where we then see Reese's vision get glitchy, only to proceed to pick up a shard of glass and dislodge the port on his head, pulling it out, and then even more gruesomely pushing the shard into his eye to take out his echo eye, where we see him pull out the cord bit by bit as it comes out of his eye, eventually unplugging it to ultimately defeat Jack here, where we are given his final choice here. That doesn't really matter to the plot of him keeping or crushing the echo eye, which obviously I think crushing it means a lot more here. But really, all of this is this very grotesque visual of Reese having to essentially destroy himself to rid himself of Jack, being very representative of what Reese had to give up due to his connections to Hyperion, showing what came of him trying to become his hero, though with this also allowing him to start over again, do things differently, an arc that I'm sure they won't mess up in future installments. But all this, again, being this great conclusion to Reese's arc, really no matter which path you end up taking here, though I do think aspects of it, I feel like they make a bit more sense down the Rule Hyperion path, but still comes off satisfactory with the other path as well. And in general, I do think it's a bit surprising that this conflict ends up being resolved so early on in the finale, with this seeming like one of the major conflicts of the entire game, though considering how Jack had to be out of the picture by time of the present, it does obviously make logical sense for this to conclude before everything gets fully caught up, as again, just trying to interject Jack into the final conflict would have been a bit contrived in that way. With that, we cut back to the Fiona side of the story, seeing her exit her pod conveniently right next to the beacon, which had already been activated by Mallory, with us hearing from Sasha that a really big monster came out of the vault, with Gortys also becoming larger as well and struggling against it, with us conveniently not being able to see any of this due to a sandstorm, assumingly started by the opening of the vault, even though that doesn't happen later, but does add this really ominous tone to this scene as we lose connection with Sasha and have to walk through the storm looking for Sasha. All people are running away in the opposite direction without barely even being able to see what is ahead of us, until we do see a giant metallic figure falling to the cliffside. This revealed to be Gortys, now being the size of a Megazord. We do see Valerie being the one attacking Gortys, shooting rockets at her, plus now attempting to stop Valerie, where along the way we can find the caravan where we can see August inside losing consciousness, all while reaching Valerie will have us being grabbed by a wounded Finch who's on the ground, where he pretends like he killed Sasha, giving us this choice of killing him or not, which again doesn't really matter. But something I do want to mention here is the fact that this is actually the last time that you get a somewhat explorable area in the game. Again, the last time you actually are able to walk around a location, which is still relatively early into the episode, which is kind of a strange aspect of this. Again, kind of being a reminder, the fact that literally every sequence in the present is in cutscene, or just you interacting with something that's directly in front of you, to where I do wonder if that is part of the limitations of having this very limited group of people working on the game. Though again, it's something I actually never realized until working on this retrospective, just how long this endgame stretch goes without any modicum of proper gameplay that, again, isn't dialogue options or quick time events. Where, again, I'm not saying that this is a major issue with, again, me never noticing it until literally as I'm writing this video. And again, it's not as noticeable as it is in future Telltale games, where I think there it's a lot more detrimental to the overall experience, but I do find it interesting that this episode in particular has very few explorable areas, which again, to be fair, is a criticism of the game as a whole. But again, I think it's fine just because of how strong the narrative as a whole is. But eventually we do reach Valerie in an action moment of running to her and kicking her in the face, only for Valerie to then say that destroying Gortys is the only way to stop all this, with Gortys even saying herself that it's the only way. Valerie ends up proceeding to be killed by the monster before she gets to shoot again, with all this really hyping up the threat level of the Vault monster here to add more stakes to this final fight in this game. But obviously this leads to Fiona having to do this herself, getting to the rocket launcher, though struggling to land a hit, only for Sasha to arrive to help, which again, I can't believe it, she's not dead. To where obviously they end up landing the shot together, but once again this ends up being another somber moment for the story here, us having to let down Gortys ourselves, in essence killing this childlike, good-natured figure, with Fiona describing it as it was all for nothing, being another loss for our characters here that actually catches us up to the present, with us being fully caught up on the story up to this point, to where we do learn about what happened in the last year, where we do see Reese having taken over the Atlas name and got the Atlas facility running again, with him looking at this as his second chance, all while Fiona's life has returned to normal, I guess. I mean, it is implied that she became a Vault Hunter in previous episodes, though here it feels like they kind of waver from that. And like, to be honest, it would feel very weird for her to become a Vault Hunter after what literally just happened when she opened the vault, even though again, obviously that is where her arc seemed to be heading after episode 3, to where I do very much wonder how much of this was a retcon, and them now not wanting it to be a guaranteed thing that she's a Vault Hunter just yet. But this is also where we get the formal reveal of why these two hate each other in the modern day, where Reese says that he's upset at her for ditching him on Helios, which, again, fair, but also could have been easily resolved in a single conversation. Oh, while Fiona is upset at Reese for having handsome Jack in his head, and that him and Jack ruined their lives. I guess. I mean, did they? Again, like, supposedly your life's back to where it was before all this even started, so did it ruin your life? Again, just being dumb from all across the board, where, again, last time we even saw her, we helped her, we gave her the beacon, also went to shut down the core so she could escape, but again, she's still upset over us not telling her about Jack in a spot where the game never gave us the choice to do so, making this feel extremely contrived, and neither of these explanations feel in line with the vitriol they had for each other during the early episodes, and it's also just really dumb to see them still bickering here, despite the fact that they literally just heard each other's stories and should know now that it's all just a complete misunderstanding, but as they continue to bicker, we do hear a familiar voice in the background with the reveal that it's Kroger, the best villain in the game, which makes you question how was he alive when we left him for dead on Helios, as it literally crashed onto Pandora. But here Kroger ends up bringing his own hostage, a bandit leader, making it clear that him and the kidnapper had some sort of agreement to trade hostages, being this nice fake out that the kidnapper might just be a random mercenary, with Kroger being the true connective tissue between all this, which would have been bad, though this does lead to the later reveal being a bit more satisfying when we actually figure that out. Now, I will say, the actual deal that's made here does seem really stupid, especially from Kroger's perspective, and he talks about how he had to kidnap the bandit leader from his camp, specifically because the kidnapper wanted him, to which would make you question at that point, why is Kroger doing this? Like, why isn't he just taking Reese and Fiona for himself, if that's really his main goal here? Anyway, we see the trade go through just for Kroger to want to kill Reese and Fiona in this spot, which, again, makes you question, why not just kill them outright? But them also saying that this is for Finch, which, like, well, Finch left you for dead. Why aren't you as upset at that as Reese and Fiona are upset at each other? Either way, before Kroger is able to kill them, the kidnapper intervenes, strangling Kroger and snapping his neck, saving them in the last second in this process, feeling like something that Loaderbot would do. I mean, outside of probably snapping someone's neck. But following this, the bandit leader ends up putting his hands up, pointing 3 lasers towards the kidnapper, implying snipers being ready to shoot at him, to where he ends up standing down, and the leader proceeds to break Reese and Fiona free, where we start to get some reveals. First seeing that the snipers are actually Hyperion employees with laser pointers, and that the bandit leader himself is Vaughn, being a cool reveal here after him being missing from the story for a while. And while it does feel very contrived initially, that just so happens that Vaughn is in this situation, obviously they end up rectifying that by the end. But again, this ends up being a pretty cool reunion with Vaughn, where, I mean, he does get the exposition as he takes us back to his base, with it being revealed that he just kind of sucked at finding us for the last year, as he had been constantly looking, supposedly, and he had in that time led a group of Hyperion refugees, with him being appointed as the leader, him being the only one that knew his way around Pandora, with them naming themselves the Children of Helios to correlate with their immaturity. But also here we get the reveal that their base is actually the wreck of Helios, which is kind of cool, where once there, we just see the group bowing down to Reese, with them even changing the Handsome Jack statue into a Reese statue by just writing his name on it, which is all weird, but again, just very strange to see Reese being looked at as some sort of prophet, this great liberator that rescued them from their corporate shackles, which again, feels like Hyperion themselves have not really done much development, them still blindly idolizing Reese like they did with Jack, but also this is this great mirroring for Reese here, him getting the respect that he wanted from the beginning, though through obviously complete opposing reasons. But entering the base, we do see that Yvette is here, if kept alive. Thank God, which is like really weird considering like she's betrayed us so many times in the past. Like, how are we keeping her in our group? And again, thankfully she doesn't betray us again. But again, it like feels very strange that she's just with us with no ramifications from all of her previous choices. But here we do get to play as Fiona as we interrogate the kidnapper, with us getting to debate who gets to be the good cop and who gets to be the bad cop. Though here the kidnapper does reveal that he does know them and that he was there when Gortys was destroyed and he saw their betrayal and he couldn't believe it. With it now being revealed that the kidnapper is actually Loaderbot, being upset that he sacrificed everything for his friends only to be betrayed, with his entire role in the present here being this attempt to get answers over why they betrayed him, with him having taken the endoskeleton that was meant for Jack for himself, giving him a new body, while not telling them his real identity from the forefront to make sure they give him the full truth, all this being, again, a near perfect reveal for me, where again, having the kidnapper actually be a relevant character here, one that has direct ties to the protagonist, but also to the player, again, I think is great. It really recontextualizes the entire modern day events, a satisfying way, in a spot where, again, I think there would be this worry that it would just be a random Borderlands character being used for fan service, but instead they actually end up utilizing a relevant character for the plot, making everything pieced together extremely well here. Again, explaining why he was picking up Gortys pieces along the way, making the conveniences of Kroger and Vaughn being involved, again, reasonable here, where Kroger being involved was so Loaderbot can get payback for Kroger having previously destroyed him, while Vaughn's involvement was due to Loaderbot wanting to reunite the group. Now, again, why isn't Sasha involved in any of this is a big question, along with, like, why was he so ruthless while he was the kidnapper in the previous episodes, and also, again, like, how realistic is that he would really be able to crawl his way all the way to Helios from the beacon when he was critically injured. But Either way, I do this as a cool reveal, pretty much best case scenario, making this feel meaningful to both the player and the characters, and being a major highlight of this game's plot when I look back at this game, especially as it directly correlates to our final mission in the game, with Loaderbot revealing that he brought everyone together. Again, but Sasha, to reassemble Gortys and summon the Vault of the Traveler, with Loaderbot saying that they will defeat him together, with him now being able to prepare this time and all being there to fight with some friends. Which I will say, I do love that this is the final conflict in this game. Obviously something that was the goal earlier, though there for more greedy motivations, because people wanted the money that was involved in taking over the vault. However, this time, we still do have this motivation of opening the vault, but more so to bring back Gortys. Much more noble cause here. And I do really love how this mission is handled as well. Again, having them go on a suicide mission here to where we need to recruit allies. Obviously characters that we had met previously, and to this, our choices from previous episodes end up actually mattering. Kind of. Which characters can accept or deny your offer to join the crew, being this, again, main ramification for your choices in previous episodes, to where, while again, who you pick to go with you doesn't affect the plot at all. I've always liked this style mechanic in Telltale games, obviously feeling in line with like The Walking Dead Season 1, and having your choices determine who goes with you to save Clementine at the end of Episode 4, like The Wolf Among Us, where your choices determine who stands by you during the final council. To where, again, all this is a really effective way of making it feel like your choices matter, even though at the end of the day, they really don't. Outside just interchangeable dialogue and some animations that end up playing. But either way, Sasha will end up joining our group, leading to us wanting to recruit 3 members for our team, because Loaderbot says that having 2 teams of 4 is the most effective for some reason, which, I mean, again, like, if we can get all these other people's help, like, why wouldn't we? But either way, there are 7 people that we have to take in consideration here. This game guaranteeing that you'll at least get 3 of them to be available at any given time. Though again, the exact criteria for unlocking specific characters here is a bit strange, which again, I'll run through them one by one. Again, you can recruit Zer0, but he'll only join your crew if Fiona is a well-known Vault Hunter, which calls back to a throwaway line back in episode 3 where you can tell Mordecai you're a Vault Hunter, which is like, why does this matter? How would he figure this out? And also, very strangely, Zer0 sounds completely different to how he did in episode 1, where it makes you wonder if they like lost the presets of the filter they put over his voice, as I believe it is the same voice actor. But anyway, Springs ends up being another character that can join based on a binary choice previously, as she will be willing to join your crew. If you had honored Scooter's memory back in episode 4, where again, don't know why this is the main driving factor for her, but nice to see your treatment of Scooter, again, coming back to bite you here. Cassius is another character we can recruit here, with the choice that determines this actually making sense this time, and it being whether or not you defended him from Athena, though also realistically, who would want Cassius on their team for this mission? If you only have 3 people to pick for your team here, would you really want Cassius, an old scientist, to be on your team? But either way, I mean, Athena ends up being a character here that can be recruited no matter what choices you make, where I do find it funny that we do see her being captured at the end of episode 3, which again, from what I understand, ends up being resolved in the pre-sequel, though none of those events end up being mentioned after the fact here. And I do find it funny how the game changes the reasoning for why Athena joins your team based on previous choices, where had you told Janie that Athena loved her or didn't take her shield back in episode 2, those will be used as the reason for her joining. And even if you don't do those things, she'll still join you anyway. And the same thing goes for August as well, where again, he will always be available, with the reasoning here being that you didn't sell him out to Valerie in episode 3, unless you did, to where instead he just joins you because you're a badass, which is so stupid. Now, Felix is also available here if he is alive, though picking him does give us a scene of us trying to meet up with him, only for him to not be there, instead call us, still being resolute at how he didn't betray us, revealing that the money from episode 1 actually didn't blow up, and that he actually has the 10 million, which again, doesn't really make sense, as he knew if there were explosives in the case, then why does he die in this situation where you don't tell him? Like, is he faking his death there? But if that is the case, then he wasn't doing all this for him, as he never appears in that other storyline. So our entire motivations around Felix's characters feel so dumb to me, but in this spot, he will give you $9 million of the 10 million, but the final option here is one that can actually only be activated if you had picked Felix earlier, where there is a mystery Vault Hunter that you can only afford if you get the 9 million from Felix, with that Vault Hunter being Clap Claptrap, a cameo from the OG games. Probably being the most iconic character in the series, and obviously ends up being used here for humor. Claptrap being this notoriously annoying character that curses a lot to where everything he says gets bleeped out, which this is a cameo that, again, is pretty pointless for the plot. Though I will say, I actually do kind of like that this is here, where again, I've kind of gotten over the notion of fan service just for the sake of it, though I do think this is a spot where it feels like a proper location to have fan service. It's something that is a very niche situation to happen. Again, this is something that most people won't ever see, where to actually get this situation, you have to specifically have Felix still alive while also proceed to pick Felix for the mission itself. So considering this is a very niche situation, I do like this feeling like this reward for going on the specific path. So while again, I don't particularly get much humor from Claptrap here personally, I do think this is a cameo that does feel like a worthy inclusion. But either way, we do get a montage of us having to pick up each of the people we selected, gathering them together to where we formulate a plan before Sasha even shows up for some reason. The plan to have Fiona and Sasha fly into the monster using the caravan and set explosives inside of him with the intention of damaging its transportation gland, which makes you question what happened to the perfect strategy of having 2 teams of 4. But the plan for the others is essentially to get the monster in range to be shot by the moonbeam, to where after formulating this plan, Sasha finally arrives, coming in with a new outfit and hairstyle, to where Reese and August just end up gawking at her. The reunion between Reese and Sasha here being romantically tinged, with her even saying that we looked for you, which, what? What happened to Fiona being upset over the Handsome Jack situation? What would they be looking for if they're this upset at him? But with that, we finally start to get things into motion, with Reese and Fiona putting the Gortys pieces together, allowing for this large Megazord version of Gortys to be revealed, with us seeing her in full view for the first time, only for the vault to instantly open as well, with the monster now labeled as the Traveler instantly emerging, leading to our final action sequence in this game, feeling pretty grand in scale, obviously us facing off against this giant monster, while we get multiple perspective changes. But we do initially see Reese trying to convince Gortys to go along with the plan, with her being scared of being beaten again. They're eventually agreeing to do so, but only if Reese strives, taking him into her cockpit, which looks eerily similar to a Megazord cockpit. Now having Reese using Gortys like a Megazord, fighting against the Traveler, which is a really cool way to have this final battle here with, again, this obviously clearly being inspired by Power Rangers, specifically as we later end up seeing the other members of the crew entering the cockpit as well, each getting their own station, which just felt like a direct ripoff there, with all this being, again, really cool to see Gortys being able to utilize the fighting abilities of the people inside of her cockpit, giving us this long sequence of Reese using his finger gun techniques to fight the monster here, which is just really ridiculous. But also, I do like how this actually, again, makes it feel like your choices matter, as again, like, depending on what characters you picked, that ends up changing the abilities that Gortys is using during this fight, which again is a cool little touch there. With again, this final fight being a really cool one visually, where again, just like in other forms of media, it is cool to see these 2 giant beings fighting against each other. Where I'll also mention the fact that QuickTime event-wise, I do feel like the QTEs in this section of the game end up feeling a bit more complex, where it's more than you just having to push one button. It's usually a sequence of buttons, which again, I do think adds more interactivity to this fight, making it feel a bit more grand as well. But outside that, we also obviously get Fiona's POV with her and Sasha driving the caravan to the Traveler, setting the explosives, only to be attacked by the Guardians, which I believe is an enemy type from the OG game, meant to be guarding vaults, though here they are inside the stomach of the Traveler. But this ends up being another solid action sequence here, them facing off against the Guardians and on zero gravity, which adds an interesting dynamic here. But eventually, obviously, they get the explosives planted, proceed to start their escape, though when pushing the button to detonate them, the explosives don't end up setting off, with them accidentally going out of range, leading to this big melodramatic moment of Sasha making the decision to make the ultimate sacrifice that will definitely cost her her life, and that she decides to jump out of the caravan, being a nice follow-up on a throwaway line back in episode 3 of her conversation with Reese, saying that she'll never sacrifice herself. But again, I remember really feeling sad during this moment in my initial playthrough, again, really being upset at Sasha dying at the final instance of this story. So again, I did take this at face value, even though she does do a wink before she leaves, which, mixing that and the fact that she constantly ends up asking Fiona if she has Felix's gift, again, it makes you think that maybe she might have known what she was doing, though, again, I don't know if that's the case. Anyway, this does allow for the transportation gland to be destroyed, allowing them to hit the Traveler with the moonbeam, leading to the final part of the fight, with Gortys now pulling out a sword as if it's her finisher, you know, like a Megazord. But again, we end up finishing the Traveler for good. But in the aftermath, we can't be happy just yet, as we obviously need to deal with the Sasha situation, with Fiona finding her dying body on the ground, which I will question how did she get there? But and this ends up being really propped up as this emotional moment, seeming to be our final conversation between Fiona and Sasha, with her mentioning Felix's gift once again, saying she wants to know what it is now, during which we have Reese crying over her, to where he says that he hopes it's like the movies and that his tears will heal her. Either way, we end up opening the gift, obviously revealing that's her watch, and she dies. It's over. Until it isn't. With her coming back to life after her watch starts to glow and her being lifted into the sky, only for it to proceed to drop her with her landing on her arm, breaking it. Ozzy's still adding humor to the sequence, though I do find this overall, bringing back Sasha back to life at the last second, to be a bit questionable here, where I remember when I initially played this game, while I was obviously happy that Sasha ends up surviving here, I was a bit disappointed that it seemed to come out of nowhere. This very much feels like a Deus Ex Machina, though in retrospect, I do think there's a little bit more setup than I initially remembered. Again, the fact that you can open up the watch back in episode 2 and see the phrase that time heals all wounds, again, implies that it's going to heal something eventually. Or again, it's technically set up there. But again, considering that is something that is optional, where again, many people probably won't ever even see that, which again, even I don't think I did on my original playthrough of the game, it can come off as this just being thrown in at the last second. So again, I can very much get how this could look at as a Deus Ex Machina and something that again just feels a bit contrived here, but I do think I'm probably more okay with it nowadays than what I was at the time, considering, again, they at least do a bit of setup. And again, I do feel like this game does deserve to end on this more hopeful tone. Following this, after saying farewell to Gortys and seeing her walk off with Loaderbot, we do get some banter between Reese and Fiona before they end up running off towards the vault together, which just in general, the vault did very much feel like an afterthought in this situation, but this was a nice callback to their more juvenile side after having us go through many darker situations throughout the course of this episode. But before they enter the vault, we do stop down with Fiona asking Reese what his intentions are with Sasha. Or you could just outright tell him to stay away from her, which feels weird. But this combo ends up seemingly solidifying the future status of Reese and Sasha's relationship, even though she never shows up again in the series outside of photos. So I do also find it funny how Reese can actually tell Fiona that he doesn't have feelings for Sasha, but actually her instead, which is very weird. It completely comes out of left field. But either way, this does show the Reese-Fiona relationship being fully repaired after the ridiculousness of their relationship being fractured to begin with. But with that, we then get to the final scene of the game with Reese and Fiona entering the vault, during which we can tell Fiona that vault hunting suits her, again making it seem like she was going to be a character utilized in the series moving forward, only for it to not be utilized outside of a minor cameo in New Tales from Borderlands, while Reese, through his arc, talking about needing to find a healthy balance with money not being everything, only for his arc to be completely ruined down the road. And in our final dialogue option, we can have Fiona tell Reese that they actually make a good team, which is a fitting final choice, though you can also tell him to stay away from Sasha, or that the treasure better be worth it, which again don't feel like as good of choices there. But in the final bit of gameplay, we do see Reese and Fiona reaching out for the chest in the center of the vault, mirroring what happened at the end of episode 1 in the Atlas facility when they reached out for the Gortys cores. But when we do, the screen ends up flashing to where we get our final shot afterwards, show them now gone, being this ambiguous ending here, the one that adds this air of mystery to the ending, but not in a way that I ever felt like I needed to see what happened to them, where I don't think it really matters. And again, I very much doubt they ever even meant to follow up on this, considering how Telltale barely even finished this game to begin with. I think they fully never expected to be able to make a sequel to this game. While from a Gearbox perspective, where obviously, yes, I do think they were meant to utilize these characters in future games, I don't think this specific plot point was something that was ever going to be followed up on. And again, I think that's fine. We don't need to know everything that happened here, to where, to me, again, I do feel like this is a pretty strong ending to the game, with their arcs being wrapped up in a pretty satisfying way. And again, that's doing a lot to mirror episode 1 as well. It's where, again, I really do like the ending here, even though it might not be the most concrete ending in the world. But there we go. I mean, that is the entirety of Tales from the Borderlands, a game that, again, really has no right being as good as it is. A game that, again, I typically probably wouldn't like in the modern day, due to its over-the-top nature and its juvenile humor. And considering all the development issues with this game and it being a game licensed from another game IP, again, I feel like all the signs point to this game being terrible, but somehow it ends up actually being one of the best games in the Telltale catalog, with some witty writing, some really compelling characters, and a much grander scale from most other Telltale games. That really makes this entry a standout. I really do adore this game, despite the fact that I'm not well versed in the Borderlands series, to where while this game obviously has some inconsistencies and some plot conveniences and some choices that don't particularly matter as much as you would want them to, I do think I come out of my experience re-experiencing this game still looking at it as one of my favorite graphic adventure games I've ever played. But with that, again, that is my retrospective of Tales from Borderlands. Now, moving forward, I do intend on continuing on these Telltale retrospectives, probably looking at around one a year, at least for the bigger games that they have made, with the next major release to talk about being Game of Thrones, which I'll probably end up doing a retrospective of. Obviously, Walking Dead New Frontier is probably the next somewhat popular game to talk about, though again, I'm still debating over if I want to wait until the 10-year anniversary to make that video or do it a bit earlier. But also, I have considered doing a video on New Tales from Borderlands, where again, I've talked about it in the past. I think New Tales from Borderlands is a complete travesty, one of the worst narrative-based games I've ever played, and again, I think it would be fun to make a video on it. But I do think there's already a very expansive video on the game by Eruption Fang that's already pretty much in line with my thoughts on the game, to where again, I end up being a bit hazy on if I want to even bother making a video of my own on it. But again, if they ever come, you'll see these videos down the road. Obviously, outside that, I'll continue to make the same type of content I do make for the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.